J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
Welcome to meeting number 128 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to ask all members and others in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Veuillez garder à l'esprit les mesures prévues.
Please bear in mind the preventive measures that are in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters.
Only use the black approved earpieces that you see connected or in front of you. You will remember that at the start of these meetings, the earpieces are not plugged in. They, of course, do plug them in if you need them. And do keep the earpieces away from all the microphones at all times. If you're not using your earpiece and have it plugged in, place it face down on the sticker on the table, either to your right or possibly your left. Just some quick housekeeping. Before we begin, your subcommittee met on Monday, June 3rd, 2024 to consider the business of the committee and agreed to make the following recommendations. Now, the subcommittee is also meeting today at 6:30 again in light of the audits that were tabled today. But what we've decided at this point, that in regard to the committee study of Report 1 ArriveCAN of the 2024 reports of the Auditor General of Canada, that the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party each prioritize one remaining witness and submit this information to the clerk. That email has been sent. The reason for this is because each of them had put forward a witness, and that witness either was declined or was unavailable. And number 2, that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police be invited to appear on Thursday, June 13th, 2024, from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. Does the committee wish to concur in the first report of the subcommittee in this Parliament? Looking for a yes, please. Yes. Yes. Very good. That makes the clerk exceptionally happy. A reminder going forward that all comments should be addressed to the chair. Conformément à l'article 108.3 du règlement, le comité entre...
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee is now undertaking its study of the housing report for First Nations that is to be found in reports 2 to 4 presented by the Auditor General and sent here March 19, 2024.
Welcome our witnesses. From the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Lance Heyman. Good day. Chief Brendan Mitchell. And as well, I have a note from the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief, Newfoundland. Thank you both for being here today. From the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, Grand Chief Cody Thomas joining us by video conference. Can you hear us okay, Chief Thomas?
Yes.
Very good. And from the Cluth-Cap First Nation, Chief Sidney Peters. Chief, can you hear us okay or hear me okay so far?
Yes, I can.
Good. Great. Thank you. Before each group will be given 5 minutes for remarks, I have a request from Chief Mitchell to open this committee hearing in a prayer, and I'm inclined to grant that. So, Mr. Mitchell, I'll turn things over to you, and then we'll get on with our opening statements.
Please stand, everybody. Creator, we give thanks for this beautiful day in Ottawa and this opportunity for us to come together in the spirit of friendship, kinship, community, collaboration, and reconciliation. Creator, we ask for your guidance as we make our deliberations today. Say what we have to say and hear questions from our committee here. Creator, this is an important conversation today as many of our communities struggle with the basics of conditions that many people in Canada enjoy. Creator, we ask that you help us with this cause. Encourage everyone here to do what we can and endeavor to create a better tomorrow for Indigenous people in our communities. Creator, we ask also that you encourage us to become the embodiment of our 7 sacred teachings, to always show humility, honesty, respect, truth, courage, wisdom, and most importantly, love for one another. Sinogama, all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll begin with our opening remarks. I'll turn to the Assembly of First Nations. Oh, Billy, okay. Well, I'm going to go first on the list then. Chief Heyman, would you like to begin 5 minutes, please?
Good afternoon. Chief Lance Heyman, Kebahwek First Nation. I'm the Housing and Infrastructure Portfolio for the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador. I also co-chair the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure at AFN and recently accepted the position of Director General of Yanachia, an innovative housing finance initiative that provides mortgages on reserve without band or government guarantees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of
Appel au règlement.
my First Nation.
On a point of order, please.
Apologize for this. I assume it's interpretation.
Exactement.
Okay, we're missing interpretation. I will keep speaking until our bloc colleague hears the words in French. I'll keep. Sorry, so I saw a thumbs up, but I think we're still kind of testing through this. And Chief, I'm sorry. I will have you start at the beginning when we're ready here, but I just want to make sure it's coming through in the 2 official languages. And so far, it does not look like it is. Now I see a thumbs up. Madame Secla-Dingangé, can you hear in French? It's working now. All right. Chief Heyman, why don't you start from the top instead of me trying to break your concentration? So please, from the top, you have 5 minutes.
So good afternoon, Chief Lance Heyman of Kebahwek First Nation. I'm the Housing and Infrastructure and Water Portfolio Holder for the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, co-chair of the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure at the Assembly of First Nations, and recently accepted the position of Director General of Yanachia, an innovative housing finance initiative that provides mortgages on reserve without band or government guarantees. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, and we're always happy to welcome you on our territory and to conduct our business. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to
Chief,
share.
excuse me just for 1 second. Could I ask you just to kind of slow down just a touch, just to help interpretation?
No
please.
problem.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our point of view on the Auditor General report on housing in First Nation communities. It's no surprise that we read in the Auditor General's report that the housing problem in First Nation communities persists, and this despite what has been raised in various reports for over 20 years. And even though housing is a basic, fundamental human right, the first message at the very beginning of the report repeats exactly what we have been conveying for a long time. Improving housing for First Nations is vital for their physical, mental, and economic well-being. That's because housing plays a fundamental role in any society. And I'm a firm believer that it's pretty hard for me as a chief to address the social ills of my community members when everybody's worried about having a roof over their head. The housing crisis in First Nation communities in Quebec and Labrador has been well documented for nearly 25 years. We have reliable data that indicates, among other things, that 10,000 housing units should be added to our housing stock of 15,000 over a 5-year period to make up for the accumulated backlog, in particular due to overcrowding, population growth, migration of members who potentially want to live in their community, and the replacement of condemned units. Our figures also indicate that 8,000 housing units require renovation or repairs. The analysis have been carried out over a long period of time indicate that when federal government invests in First Nation housing beyond its regular budgets, the effect is felt well in our communities. Of course, as needs continue to grow, the increase is growing at a slower pace. This leads me to link with recommendation 2.26 of the Auditor General's report, which reads as follows. ISC and CMHC, in collaboration with First Nations, should develop and implement the strategy to close the housing gap by 2030, and outlines how they will coordinate their efforts, identify needs and required funding, and establishes measurable targets. We believe that First Nations can play an important role in closing the housing gap, not only in the development of a strategy, but also in the financial framework that result from it. For example, we know that there is a continuation of needs in community that goes from shelters to social housing to private home ownership. Private housing is precisely a model that a larger proportion of our members could certainly opt for if the opportunities were present. There is a potential in this area which deserves to be further developed. First Nations and their financial institutions could then play a significant role in eliminating the housing gap. Yanachia Housing Finance is one of those opportunities and is a part of the solution. To this, we need the commitment of our partners to strengthen the capacities and to take direction and to help us secure capital. There are good practices in this area. We have piloted and had been delivering this initiative to Quebec First Nations for years, and we know that there is a need for this nationally, and the NACA network and the Indigenous financial institutions are the right vehicle to help address this issue. Precisely on the question of capacities, recommendation 2.46 of the Auditor General report fits perfectly with our regional strategy. Strengthening skills and capacities is a crucial aspect of any action plan aimed at obtaining better housing results in our communities, because they are often have to deal with complex situations of great need, which are increasing in a context of continued underfunding. Recommendation 2.60 of the report refers to ISK Transfer Initiative. You know the housing situation in First Nation communities. The report is very revealing on this subject. Yes, we want more governance by First Nations in housing, but not at any cost. Current conditions, notably the accumulated backlog and the programs as designed, are not favorable to a transfer of responsibilities. There are prerequisites that must be met for First Nations to embrace and thrive under such a change. Any reform, modernization, and transfer initiative must be accompanied by upstream funding that is sufficient, predictable, and recurring, and not based solely on current funding envelopes. Thank you for the invitation and for listening to me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions following the other presenters' presentations. Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief Heyman. I'll turn now to Chief Mitchell. You have the floor for about 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I can be 5 minutes. I'll do my best. I was actually coming here expecting to have half an hour, so I wasn't too well informed on how much time I had, but here it is.
Well,
Anyway.
Chief Mitchell, I'll give you a little hint. Try to keep it to 5 minutes, and believe me, there's all kinds of people in this room that will be asking you questions to fill in some of
Great.
that 30
Well,
minutes,
thank
okay?
you.
Over
Thank
to you.
Chair. Again, my name is Brendan Mitchell. I am the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Newfoundland. In my role at the Assembly of First Nations, I chair the Management Committee, but I'm also the portfolio holder and chair of the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. And there we also talk about water and homelessness. I'm honored to be here with you today and acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I always enjoy coming to Ottawa, and we're here today, Chief Lance and I, and those online, with an opportunity to speak to what I believe are some significant people in this country in terms of hopefully helping us with our conditions we have in our communities. Having housing, water, highways, community buildings, utilities, and reliable internet are things that many Canadians take for granted. I was one of those Canadians living in Cornerbrook, Newfoundland, where we have an abundance of all these things. I can still go to a salmon river and fish and scoop up a cup of water out of a river and drink it without fear of contamination or getting sick. So we've been blessed in many ways to be in that part of the world. But for many people in our communities, these items are not readily available, and conditions lack those enjoyed by most Canadians. For First Nations, chasing or closing the infrastructure gap is among the most ambitious, significant, and overdue commitments the Government of Canada has made. It was disheartening that the Auditor General's report on housing in First Nations communities highlighted a distressing and persistent pattern of failure on the part of the federal government to address First Nations housing needs. I'm deeply troubled by the Auditor General's findings and the government's lack of progress and ability to effectively address the ongoing crisis of unsafe and inadequate housing in First Nations in this country. The Auditor General report reaffirms what First Nations have been saying about the housing crisis for decades. That is, the federal government is failing to meet its housing obligations to First Nations. As the Auditor General points out, Indigenous Services Canada and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the two government organizations responsible for First Nation housing, have made no meaningful improvement in First Nation housing conditions since 2015. The Auditor General's report has made it clear that the Government of Canada is falling short of its own deadline to close the gap by 2030. First Nations deserve more than failed promises. Just recently, I was interviewed by ATPN, and they asked me about the federal budget and the auditor's report. And they said, Chief Mitchell, what's the likelihood of closing the gap by 2030? I said, it's not going to happen. It can happen. In fact, what I said, and I'll share it with you, my view is that the gap by 2030 will widen. So we have a lot of work to do. And the Auditor General's report really claims that the solution begins with dedicated long-term funding investments for First Nations housing, which Budget 2024 has failed to provide. I restated my concerns, opinions again in a press conference held here at Parliament Hill together with the National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak, and some other chiefs right after the budget announcement, of course, in commentary by the Auditor General. It's a tough situation that we face. The FN collaborated with industry experts and over 400 First Nations to co-develop a landmark report alongside Indigenous Services Canada that estimates the national capital and operational investments needed from the Government of Canada to fulfill its mandate to close the First Nations infrastructure gap by 2030. There was a lot of work done in preparing our report on where we are. How are we going to get there? By 2030, again, my view is we're not going to get there. Specifically in terms of housing in First Nation communities, the report points to a gap of $135 billion based on data in 2023. Again, the gap will only continue to grow until decisive investments are being made. Better housing enables access to employment, wealth, and positive physical and mental health. I'm a big believer in education of our young people in our communities, not only in Newfoundland and Labrador, but across the country. And having better housing may result or could result in a better outcome. Young people have a better opportunity to become educated, to create opportunity for themselves and their families eventually. The opposite of doing that, of course, is the situation we find today. Many young people are leaving their communities and their homes because they don't like the housing situation they face or they don't like the community situation they're involved in. Where do they end up? They end up in our larger urban centers, often on the street, homelessness, in trouble, sometimes incarcerated, and yes, sometimes the ultimate situation they face is death. I believe personally that having a solid home base with supports culturally, physically, financially, is where we need to be in this country to change the situation that we have with young Indigenous people today. We get some of this through better housing. The Auditor General's report called for a fundamental shift in how federal programs and policies are developed. This shift is urgently needed to drive significant progress, meaning federal housing policies must be fully co-developed with the AFN and First Nations. Federal Budget 2024 fell short of addressing the urgent long-term needs of First Nations in Canada. I recognize that investments have been made in the last few years toward closing the socio-economic gap between First Nations and the rest of Canada. Gaps still persist and widen in critical areas like housing and infrastructure.
And Mr. Chief Mitchell, I'm going to ask you to wind it down now, if you could,
Thank
please.
you very much. And these investments are not just financial commitments, they're critical steps toward fulfilling Canada's fiduciary obligations to First Nations and addressing historical inequities to ensure the health, safety, and prosperity of First Nations people. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to make a presentation to 5 ministers and 3 parliamentary secretaries at the Shaw Centre here in Ottawa. And I gave them the analogy. I said, consider an apple and trying to be eaten. We say apple is eaten one bite at a time. We have a large apple in front of us right now, extremely large one, and we're not going to eat it with little bites. We need some big bites, and we need investment in big bites to try to improve the situation, especially if we're still going to talk about a target of 2030.
And Chief Mitchell, that is a perfect place for me to pause. I am sure people are going to come back and ask you questions. Thank you. I appreciate your understanding. Grand Chief Thomas, you have the floor for about 5 minutes, please.
Tanse Ugama Cody Thomas Netsiga Sum Muskegsico Chinia. Good afternoon, esteemed members of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. My name is Grand Chief Cody Thomas, Grand Chief of the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations and the Chief of Enoch Cree Nation. I'm speaking to you today from my home of Enoch Cree Nation, located within Treaty 6 territory. First off, my apologies. I do need to acknowledge the opening prayer, and I do need to be thankful to Creator for the opening day of our life that we're given today. So I want to thank Creator and acknowledge the opening prayer. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about a matter of critical importance to First Nations communities. Housing has a fundamental right. I'm hoping to be blunt with my remarks today, starting with the fact that housing is a fundamental human and treaty right. Yet for many First Nation communities, this is not a reality. 60% of unhoused people suffering on the streets of Edmonton are Indigenous. There is a total lack of housing available to First Nations peoples on and off the reserve. We are in a crisis and we need more support now. The cycle of inadequate housing, funding, overcrowding, and homelessness continues to plague our people, compounding on top of issues related in health, education, and overall well-being. It is critical to understand that housing is not just about having a roof over one's head. It is about creating a continuum of housing opportunities, building safe, stable environments where individual families can thrive. The housing crisis in First Nation communities is rooted in several issues. Many homes are in despair, lacking basic amenities such as clean water and proper sanitation. Overcrowding is rampant, leading to conditions that are harmful to physical and mental health, including mold in our homes. Furthermore, the lack of adequate housing often forces our members into urban centers where they face additional challenges related to discrimination, unemployment, and access to services, not to mention raising rental costs facing everyone in our cities today. To say that our nations are funded inadequately to address these challenges is a massive understatement. Enoch Cree Nation, for example, receives $184,000 in funding each year to build new housing for our members. Yet we have 500 families on our waiting list. In discussing this with our Treaty 6 chiefs, I have heard similar funding amounts of their nations, with thousands of additional families across Treaty 6 in need of housing across the Confederacy. This is woefully inadequate to address housing needs of our people. How are we expected to provide safety and security to our people with that level of funding? The AG report, the recent Auditor General report, confirms our concerns as chiefs. The AG report stated there has been no meaningful improvement in housing since this government took power in 2015. We have seen no meaningful progress to address the First Nation housing gap. In 2021, the AFN estimated the gap to be at $44 billion, and we know that in 2024, the number is much higher, perhaps as high as $60 billion in reality. We know also that CMHC has been relying on 2001 census data, denying First Nation peoples in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba over $250 million in funding that we are all entitled to. We watch as organizations with national scopes are presented as offering solutions to our people, and yet we do not see any Albertan First Nation representation on these bodies. Impact on health and well-being. What does all of this mean for our people? There is a direct link between housing and health. Poor housing conditions contribute to the prevalence of respiratory illness, infectious diseases, and mental health issues. The stress and instability associated with adequate housing can also lead to higher rates of substance abuse and domestic violence. Addressing the housing crisis is not just a matter of infrastructure, but is also a critical step towards improving the overall health and well-being of our communities. The need for collaborative solutions, and so we were arrived at a critical junction where it will take united commitment to address these challenges, commitment from all orders of government to work together alongside First Nations. Temporary solutions are no longer sufficient. We need more transformative, lasting approaches that address the root cause of housing instability. This requires collaboration between First Nations, municipal, provincial, and federal governments, as well as private and non-private sectors. What are proposed solutions? We need to invest in sustainable housing projects. We need investments in building new energy-efficient homes that meet the cultural, environmental needs of our communities. These projects should prioritize local employment and training opportunities, empowering our people to be part of the solution. These projects should recognize our limited land bases and support both on and off reserve housing constructions. We need to renovate existing infrastructure. Many existing homes need urgent repairs and upgrades. Programs that provide funding and resources for renovations can help improve living conditions and extend the lifespan of current housing stock. We need support for mental health and addiction services. Housing initiatives must be integrated and comprehensive support services, including mental health and addiction services. Providing these services within the community helps ensure that individuals have the stability they need to recover and thrive. And we need long-term funding and policy commitments. Addressing the housing crisis requires long-term sustainable funding and policy commitments. This includes ensuring that funding mechanisms are flexible and responsive to the unique needs of First Nation communities, and that the bodies in charge of this funding include representation from our peoples, not individuals who claim to speak for us. In closing, I urge this committee and the broader government to engage in constructive dialogue with First Nation leaders and our technicians. By working together, we can develop a comprehensive, collaborative action plan that ensures every member of our community has access to safe, adequate, and affordable housing. This is not just a housing issue, it is a step towards reconciliation, more equal future for all. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that committee members might have about the reality of housing for Treaty 6 First Nations. Exe and hi.
Thank you very much. And finally, we'll turn to Chief Peters. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Chief Peters, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's quite all right.
Yes, my name is, of course, Chief Sid Peters from Glooscap First Nation, as well as the co-chair for the Assembly of Nova Scotia Chiefs. I also sit on the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, representing the Atlantic through the Atlantic Policy Congress. I just wanted to say, it's nice to be here and listen to my colleagues. Some of the stuff that I might have to say might be, might be the same as everybody else, but I think it's important that we understand this. So as we know, on March 19th, 2024, the Auditor General of Canada released the second report for the Parliamentary of Canada of 2024 on housing in the First Nation communities. Many people living in our First Nation communities do not have access to housing that is safe and in good condition, which is a fundamental right. Improving housing in First Nations is vital for the physical, mental, and economic well-being of all our First Nations people in Canada. This is the fourth time since 2003 the Auditor General has raised concerns about the housing in First Nation communities. However, despite the findings of each of these audits and the recommendations made, Indigenous Service Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation have failed to make the significant progress in supporting First Nations to improve housing conditions in their communities. The Government of Canada has made extensive commitments to First Nation communities to provide funding for critical infrastructure to improve living conditions. In the Prime Minister's mandate letter to Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hadu, the government committed to making immediate and long-term investments to support the ongoing work to close the infrastructure gap by 2030. The Assembly of First Nations, in partnership with Indigenous Service Canada, has co-developed a comprehensive cost report quantifying the capital and operation costs required to close the infrastructure gap by 2030 in the First Nation communities. The investment needed to close the infrastructure gap by 2030 is $349.2 billion, and as a result of the decades of underfunding, failure of fiduciary duties, and the unfair distribution of wealth in Canada, this includes $135.1 billion for housing, $59.5 billion for infrastructure, and $55.4 billion in direct asks from First Nations. Given the scale and geographic range, national construction constraints, and the lack of recent and meaningful government investments, The mandate to close the infrastructure gap by 2030 may not be achievable until the year 2040, which increases the estimated total investment required to $527.9 billion. The total capital investment required to close the gap in Atlantic Canada is $12.4 billion, with a total operations and maintenance investment of $2.6 billion, for a total investment of $15 billion required to close the gap by 2030 in Atlantic First Nations. If no action is taken, the total investment to close the infrastructure gap by 2040 in Atlantic Canada would increase to $24.9 billion. A housing needs survey was sent out to the housing staff in Atlantic, Nova Scotia, and Atlantic Canada. 16 of 34 First Nations in Atlantic Canada responded to the survey. The total reported population of the 16 First Nations that responded to the survey is 75% of the total registered population of our First Nation members in Atlantic Canada. Therefore, this indicates that the data collected during the survey is reflective of what is happening in the entire region. Atlantic First Nations needs an estimate of 12,799 units to address the backlog in immediate needs of community members. The number of units will require an investment of $3.4 billion. An additional $158 million is required to make the necessary repairs and renovations in our existing units. Based on this information, the First Nations in Atlantic Canada agree with the Auditor General's report. Without any meaningful investment in housing and infrastructure, particularly with respect to building the capacity of First Nations at the grassroots level, the infrastructure gap will only continue to grow. The way the federal government currently does business only benefits those with own source revenues or with the capacity to apply on programs. The way government does business only perpetuates the cycle on inequity that continues to make the gap grow rather than shrink. The only way forward is to work together, holding each other accountable, coming up with innovative solutions. Status quo is no longer a viable policy option. Just want to thank you very much, and Walalan. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I'll now begin our first round of questions. The first four members will have 6 minutes each. Mr. Melillo, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here on this important study. Obviously, we're talking about the Auditor General report about housing on First Nation, and I think we all know it's quite a scathing report. It highlights a number of failures in the government, and it was mentioned earlier both that there's no plan. The Auditor General found that there's no plan to close this housing gap by 2030, and in fact, there's been no meaningful improvement in housing conditions since 2015, which is a concern for many Canadians, First Nations, and non-Indigenous people across the country. In fact, the number of homes needed to be replaced or found to be deteriorating conditions has actually increased since 2015. So I guess I'll start with the gentleman in the room here, and if anyone has comments, please try to get my attention. Raise your hand or whatever you need. I guess I'm just curious if you can elaborate a bit more. I'll start with you, Chief Hammond. You mentioned in opening comments, but how is this playing out on the ground on First Nations? What does it mean? I mean, it's one thing to look at the report and look at these numbers. They're staggering. But can you offer some more specific examples that you've heard about how this is impacting lives in First Nations?
Well, I can give you concrete examples. So we talk about, the amount of funding that's available to build housing in our communities. I think, I heard one of the chiefs mention they're not getting very much funding. So in Quebec region this fiscal year, CMHC's funding, Quebec receives 7% of the national budget. Historically, we received 12%, but in 2001-2, with the adoption of the interim allocation model, Quebec saw its proportional share of the national budget drop to 7%. So this fiscal year, CMHC Section 95 programs, one of their legacy programs, is going to build a total of 30 units for 43 communities and in Quebec. And off of the top, 10 of those units go directly to the Crees because the Crees have a treaty and they get 38% of the regional budget. So that leaves 20 units for 33 communities that I represent. So that is a concrete example of chronic underfunding and what it means for First Nations in Quebec. And because of that reality, we've had to look at innovative and new ways to address our housing needs. And a number of communities developed Yanachia, which is a financial model which allows us to provide mortgages on reserve without ministerial loan guarantees or the bank having to guarantee. Because currently, First Nations are the only jurisdiction in this country that has to guarantee every single loan or mortgage that our members make for housing. And we have to also guarantee those mortgages for social housing. And each of these mortgages that we guarantee goes against our contingent liability. So many of our communities are so in debt with mortgaging for housing because social housing just doesn't meet the needs. So Yanachia is, again, an opportunity for First Nations, members of our community who are caught between a rock and a hard place. Most of government funding is for social housing. There are individuals in our community who have the ability, the capacity, and want to pay, and the credit worthiness to do so. Unfortunately, there's no government assistance to help them, so they're caught and they're left in limbo.
I just want to follow up quickly on the program. Can you explain for the committee how common, or perhaps how uncommon, I should ask, it is for First Nations to be able to have that ability to have the mortgage and own property?
It's very difficult because Section 89 of the Indian Act does not allow for the seizure of property on reserve. So through an innovative process of a tripartite agreement between Indigenous financial institution, the Band Council, and the individual homeowner, we have been able to put $28 million of mortgages into the system, which have resulted in over 300 units being built or renovated in First Nation communities in Canada. And now we're seeking, the capital to be able to expand the program in Quebec and also across the country. Home ownership, it's not for every First Nation, but it absolutely has to be part of the equation going forward. We have credit-worthy individuals who want to be able to pay for their housing, and it's unfair that, the dependency on social housing programs has left us in this particular situation.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to move on, just with limited time, to Chief Peters. I believe in your opening remarks you mentioned about the construction constraints. I'm interested in just digging into that a little bit more. I know, in my region, we're rural, remote, and northern, so a lot of construction costs are exacerbated, transportation, things like that, whether it's the carbon tax or other taxes that make construction costs even higher. So I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on what you meant when you said that there are construction constraints.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, of course, what's happening here in the Atlantic is we're not a real big region, but ever since this whole thing come down in regards to how much money's coming down for even off reserve housing and stuff, it's finding it more and more difficult to get suppliers to get material in because everybody else is tapping into it. Everybody else seems to be going for it. It's the same thing we're finding in regards to tradespeople. Is trying to get enough tradespeople to actually do the work. But having said that, I mean, the cost over the past few years has substantially increased. And as a result, of course, we're not getting as many houses. Just as Chief Lanceman said, that it's very difficult, when you don't have enough dollars to build the units. And it's just so expensive that the poor communities just don't have that extra money. Some communities do okay; they have own source revenues to do that, but a lot of them don't have that extra money, and just resources, getting the material and stuff has been quite difficult here, and also the timing in which getting approvals. again, we always seem to run into winter construction. If we could get the dollars earlier in the year, even commit it a year before to say, okay, come April 1st, you're ready, you guys are ready to go. But it always seems like we're always behind the eight ball of getting construction started.
Thank you, Chief. Turning now to Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I was thinking a lot about this report and its impact and the concerns that the communities have raised, which are very, very legitimate. I wonder what the intersection is with climate change. And I ask this because, like over the last year, we had over 420 forest fires. How does that impact housing? How does that impact the living space of communities in areas where, from an urban area like myself, I wouldn't even begin to imagine? So perhaps, Mr. Mitchell, if we can start with you, and I would love to hear from everyone on this.
Thank you. We've had a lot of conversation about climate change in the last number of years, and we see so many conditions changing. The numbers of natural disasters or incidents is increasing, but so much so in severity of these incidents. And if a forest fire, for example, impacts an Indigenous community, it can be the case that community is wiped out. No housing, so what do? We've heard from other chiefs today about situations in our own provinces and generally about what's happening in the country. I think climate change will continue to have a big impact on Indigenous communities, particularly northern communities or remote communities, where once a forest fire gets going, what's the likelihood of losing an entire community? It's highly likely. So yes, that will be an important consideration for sure. As Chief Peters says, the cost of housing, the remoteness of communities make even building housings more difficult than it would be where you live or where I live, for example. And we're seeing housing costs alone in materials go up by 40% since COVID. These are the numbers that are being shared with me. And of course, Chief Peters also referred to the availability of adequate tradespeople or labor. In a smaller community, that situation becomes even worsened. And yes, we are facing a problem in this country with respect to climate change. And just for a record, my view is we're in for one hell of a summer in this country with forest fires. We're seeing it now in every province. We're going to see it in Newfoundland and Labrador. And of course, British Columbia is already at it in some other places in the country. So when these communities are lost, it makes it very difficult to put back what was there or to put back better in a reasonable timeline. And climate change will continue to be a contributing factor in the livelihoods and well-being of some of our communities. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Mr. Heyman, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I tend to agree with everything that Brandon has mentioned because our communities are vulnerable. We are isolated away from, main societies. Many of our communities, a lot of them don't have road access. And quite frankly, to be honest and to be fair, when Government of Canada created reserves, they didn't give us the best pieces of land. So many of our communities are already experiencing the consequences of climate change. I think of many communities who every spring have to worry about their community and their homes being flooded out on a regular basis. And that means that these community members are removed from those houses and put in temporary housing, whether it's hotels or other solutions. And some of them wait many, many, many years to return, if they get to return at all. Because again, there's no additional funds to address these needs, and insurance protection also becomes an issue for us as more and more incidents of climate change and direct impacts in our communities occur.
Thank you for that. Chief Peters, how do we ensure as a government that we are providing that support based on what is in front of us today?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I remember talking to developers and stuff in regards to this, how climate change is making a big difference. I often said it's not very difficult to build a new house or build subdivisions. It's a pretty easy process. But having said that, taking into consideration about environment, the climate change and what is happening. Like here in Nova Scotia, with these mass floods that's been happening, and of course we experienced a forest fire as well. So I think it's important that we ensure that we understand that we have the proper research and actually knowing exactly, because the majority of our communities here in the Atlantic are on waterways. As we all know, that was our highways way back when, and a lot of them were located there. But like Lance has mentioned, some of the lands that we have is not that great of lands on reserve. But I think it's important that we do the proper research to understand climate change, really truly how it works. But we also got to realize that the building envelope of an actual house needs to change as well. I mean, it is changing, but I don't know whether it's changing fast enough. But the whole research and education of operating a house needs to change too. And I don't believe that we'd be able to provide enough capacity to our local people living in the units to to understand how climate change is actually changing the structure of the houses and how national building codes need to change to take that into consideration.
I appreciate that, and Chief, if you can perhaps help us understand how has the Government of Canada or Indigenous Services Canada communicated with you or worked with you to try to figure out what housing looks like with taking into account what climate change is impacting and how people are living.
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, I've been working in housing for 38 years, and one of the things years ago through Canada Mortgage and Housing, they used to have some training in building capacity within communities. And I know Lance knows this as well. They used to have an inspection program where they would have, native inspector services that Canada Mortgage and Housing would sponsor. But now that has actually been taken away from us, which is unfortunate because we were building capacity of inspections and services within all our communities to ensure that houses are built, to the National Building Code and taken into consideration of how things have changed in climate change. If anything, what has happened, taken away that whole inspection services and building that capacity, and CMHC doesn't even have the capacity. And to be honest with you, Canada Mortgage and Housing was supposed to be the housing experts in Canada. Now we're talking, as Lance has mentioned, with the budgets that's coming out, there's no way you're ever going to meet the need. So as a result, you have serious issues happening within the communities. But having said that, for some reason, the government's not listening to us. It's very frustrating. We're getting houses in some areas being built, maybe not necessarily to the building code, but we've lost a lot of expertise in the field of First Nations only because of some issue in regards to the federal government or Canada Mortgage and Housing saying it's a liability issue in regards to training the inspectors and have them do the inspections. I just think, honestly, we've gone backwards on that. So right now we're depending on municipal inspectors in a lot of our areas.
Excuse me, Chief Peters, I'm going to pause you right there. I appreciate that thorough answer, and I'm sure members will come back to you.
Okay.
Just for our witnesses, if this is a good time to put in your earpiece for translation. Not proszę. Or yes, or if you're online, there is a globe, which I think you can hit English, and will come through with translation. If you're here in the room, please plug in your earpieces. Suivant, c'est Monsieur Lemire, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Lemieux, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for being so kind. I very much appreciate your advice. Kwe Chefimen Miigwech for being here. I'm very honored to have this exchange with you. I'm going to read in the findings, paragraph 2.18. It is noted that CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada have accepted the fact that there is a housing gap but there was no strategy to help the First Nations to breach that gap before 2030. Is this not a perfect opportunity, Chief, to try to come up with a strategy that would put forward the expectations of Indigenous people to allow us to fill this gap in terms of housing construction?
Monsieur le Président, on m'indique que le
Chair, the video is not working. I just want to be sure that there's the video, you say? I'm being told that the video that did not follow, and therefore for the people that are online are having difficulty.
Just one sec. Et puis j'ai arrêté.
I've stopped the clock as well for you.
Encore une fois, Monsieur le Ministre.
Once again, Mr., you're saying the video isn't working? The camera is not working for the people. The people online aren't appearing on camera.
C'était ça, là.
Monsieur Lemire,
Mr. Lemire, are you talking about the video? Is it the video that's aimed at you, the camera that's supposed to be aimed at you? I don't think it works like that, sir. You can't see them. But online, are they able to hear what I'm saying? Is the broadcasting okay? Do you think it's not working?
yeah, on va continuer parce que
We'll continue then. And we'll check with you. You have 5 minutes left. Chef Emin, so how can we have a housing strategy that will be carried out in cooperation with Indigenous experts?
So I think the solution and the answer really rests with the fact that the Assembly of First Nations did a tremendous amount of work over the last number of years to identify what those needs are across this country. And what we haven't had an opportunity to do yet is to sit down with government and discuss how we can go forward in addressing those needs. Because surely there is a need for continued investment for social and affordable housing. But we also need to, as I mentioned earlier, take into consideration there are other aspects of housing where we feel needs investment, and that in terms of private home ownership is absolutely an essential part of the discussion. So I think it's fundamentally key that the Government of Canada sit down with First Nations, whether it be through the Assembly of First Nations or inviting chiefs like the chief from Treaty 6 to come and represent his constituents and sit down and work with us to find a solution. Because clearly government is not going to be able to pony up $135 billion to meet our housing needs. So we need a combination of government investment, private financing, and we absolutely at some point need banks to stand up and take a chance and, you know, put their risk aversion aside and invest in our communities. Indigenous financial institutions are prepared to do that work if the banks won't do so, but we need to have that conversation so that we can find a solution to the overall housing needs that exist in our community, from, you know, shelters right through the whole continuum to home ownership and also the importance of renovation. I'd also need to talk about the fact that, look, it's just simply not housing. You know, if you gave us $135 billion to build housing, we're not having the right conversation because there's a significant amount of infrastructure that is required. Lot development, water treatment plants, sewer treatment plants are all part of the equation. So we need a fulsome approach, and you can only get that through direct dialogue and discussion with the rights and the stakeholders like First Nations. Thank you for the question.
Donc, je comprends que
So I understand that the initiative you mentioned would allow for the development of knowledge amongst Indigenous peoples in terms of construction. But when it's time to build a new housing unit, you want to be able to offer something very concrete, rather. Say, for example, architectural services, infrastructure services, community services. You see that as a turnkey project to be given to a community to be able to breach this gap that exists in housing construction.
Yes.
ça a le mérite d'être clair. J'aime ça.
Oh, I love that. What clarity. And with Anantia, since it's an investment fund, there are, of course, risks that are taken. We know that our society today tolerates less and less risk. It's risk aversion. There's a great deal of risk aversion, but you have these institutions that are going to fund these solutions. So what do you see as solutions that can be put in place to ensure that you have insurance that is necessary and that there will be profit that will ensue, because that's how our capitalistic society works? Can you speak to the philosophy of these Indigenous funds like Enuntia?
Yenachia offers an opportunity to diversify, the housing offering that First Nations have. Currently, the most First Nations, we wait for our funding allocation from CMHC and ISK, and we move forward and develop housing plans. Yenachia, takes the burden from the Band Council of having to be responsible for guaranteeing and the management of every single loan. In non-Indigenous world, people are granted mortgages based on their credit strength. That doesn't exist in First Nation communities because we have many members who have great credit and credit strength, but struggle to secure a mortgage on reserve, either because the band does not have the financial capacities to guarantee the level of loans required, or there's limited options. So we need a full spectrum of options, and Yenachia, allows for that individual to be recognized on his credit strength, and that relationship is between the financial institution and the individual. And the Band Council plays a minor role in terms of ensuring that in the event of default, and in Quebec we have had none in all of the years of delivering the program, that there is a remedy in place. So yes, I agree, the world is risk averse, but I think the biggest risk that we face is that we continue to do the same thing over and over, and in 10, 5, 15 years, the Auditor General comes back and reports that the same outcomes are occurring. The biggest risk is the risk of not doing anything at all.
Thank you very much.
Miigwech.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The next.
6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Tansei to the Grand Chief of Treaty 6. It's good to see you, Cody. I hope you're doing well. I'm definitely jealous you're in Oilers country right now. I'm here in Ottawa and cheering on the Oilers all the way over here. But I know we have important business to get to, so I'll speak directly to you, Grand Chief, just to clarify some of the damning information that was presented by the Auditor General. And I'll quote from her speech, as a matter of fact. She said, quote, "This is the fourth time since 2003 that we have raised concerns about housing in First Nations communities, and 20 years later, many of these concerns still persist. Despite these audits, we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation have made little progress in supporting First Nations to improve housing conditions in their communities. We also hear, Grand Chief, very often in this place that there's a housing crisis, but albeit this housing crisis that's been on First Nations communities has been a long-standing one. Do you want to comment just on how long and generational this crisis has been?
Yeah, hi for that. It's good to see you, Blake. Hope all is well from Oilers country. Yeah, no, it's been going on for decades. I would honestly say since inception, our inception of our treaty. I think that the data that's being collected within CMHC and ISC is outdated. I just think the whole system's broken when it comes to the fiduciary responsibility of the Crown. I think the real solution is finding sustainable funding, increasing the standard of living when it comes to the homes that are being built, not just cookie cutter style homes. I hear the other Ogamawas, the other chiefs set them in on the material aspect of the homes when it comes to climate change as well, the energy efficiency. There's so much to go on about. I know we're not going to solve this all today, but I do want to stress we're not looking for a handout. We're looking for a hand up and a way to collaborate and give advice from an Indigenous lens on what we're facing and the reality of maybe a 3-bedroom home that's built and you have 14 people living in that home. So you have a cistern, a septic tank that is over capacity, the cheapest materials. I think even with the Rapid Housing Initiative, a lot of nations are being denied that funding. I think us being at the table and finding solutions together and giving you a broader perspective when it comes to the shortage of infrastructure, and then even with the funding for mortgages on reserve, we're working on a rent-to-own model right now within our nation. Just to solve our housing crisis in my nation right now, we're looking at approximately just under $300 million. That includes $56 million of infrastructure, and then that's only putting a dent into our housing crisis as well. As we don't have enough land, we're short approximately 486 homes, and that would put a dent in half that cost. But it's not only just my nation. As the Grand Chief of Treaty 6, there's many nations that are secluded that don't have the capacity and a proper standard of building homes. Like, yeah, we want to contribute. Yes, there may be a lack of tradespeople, but how are we ever going to learn if we're not given the opportunity to invest in our people to learn those skilled traits as well? Because we want to contribute. But it's just some of the houses too. I'll just speak to this and I'll be frank. Some of the models that CMHC has rolled out, these slab homes that are handicap accessible. We have homes that have wooden foundations. It's just unacceptable. And I really appreciate the conversation around introducing a different catalog, but I'm not one that lives by status quo. I really want to be a catalyst on creating change and increasing that standard of living for peoples because we deserve it, and we shouldn't be living this way because it's just time and time again, spinning wheels isn't going to get us anywhere. I think initially if we were to come up with a better process or having our voices heard to that extent, I think contributing in that fashion where we got to step up too. We got to pay a portion to a certain extent, and the fiduciary responsibility of diversifying and not going based off of data that is outdated. The system's broken, and if we want to fix it, we got to put in the work. So,
no, I appreciate that.
We may have a model that's coming down the pipe for you guys over there as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. We need a fundamental change in how this work is operating. You know, the treaty, significant document, commits the Crown to working directly with Treaty 6, and we haven't seen evidence of that in many ways, and the issues we're seeing and persisting in communities is evidence of that. But I just want to turn to another topic. We hauled in CMHC here, and I, as you might know, really criticized them in relation to the use of outdated census information. They promised me at that time, they said, don't worry, Mr. Desjardins, we are going to meet with the partners in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and we're going to update the formula. And so I want to ask you directly, did CMHC reach out to you to talk about the money that they shortchanged you?
No.
And Mr. Chair, time?
We're getting near the end, so a brief question would be ideal.
Sure. And what would, and if, in the evidence that CMHC hasn't done that, and you've mentioned that you yourself, your community at Enoch, is only funded $184,000 a year?
Yes, that is correct.
And that's not nearly the percentage required.
We have to take our own source funding to create our housing model out here. Like it's not getting any better. We mortgage just like every other Canadian through CMHC, and that's the funding we have to work through. It's very tough. So.
And is that in any way, shape, or form, in your mind, the spirit and intent of the treaty?
The spirit and intent of our treaty was 50-50. We were to share in collaboration of the settlers to share in the abundance of wealth that our Turtle Island carried in Mother Earth. So I don't see that happening, and yeah, it's frustrating, guys. That's the biggest request I get from our members, and we have the second largest Indigenous population in my backyard. I border the city of Edmonton, and it's not getting any easier. So.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next two rounds, to keep us on time, I'm going to reduce everyone by the government in opposition, official opposition, to 4 minutes, and the other two parties 2 minutes. I've been allowing answers to go over. Everyone had really an extra minute that last turn, but I do want to make sure we get a full 2 rounds in. So, Mr. Stewart, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Being from Miramichi Grand Lake in New Brunswick, living within the Mi'kmaq ancestral region, I would prefer the questions answered by Chief Mitchell or Chief Peters, but I'm also free to have anybody else answer it at the same point. It's unfortunate the subject matter today is how Indigenous Service Canada and the CMHC have poorly managed housing conditions in First Nations communities. As former Minister of Aboriginal Affairs in New Brunswick, as you can imagine, I've seen this up close and personal for about a 2-year period when I was Minister. I'll repeat what I said to the Auditor General when she first presented her report on housing in First Nations communities and the work of Canada's first female Auditor General, Sheila Fraser. In her farewell speech, Madam Fraser criticized the truly shocking lack of improvements on First Nations reserves, and she said, and I quote, "I actually think it's quite tragic when you see that there's a population in this country that does not have the sort of basic services that Canadians take for granted. The recent Office of the Auditor General report on housing in First Nations communities show a lot of similarities to the former Auditor Fraser's comments, which is very unfortunate to see a complete lack of progress over the past 9 years. According to the Office of the Auditor General, Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC do not have a strategy to support First Nations in closing the housing gap by 2030, and even worse, according to the Office of the Auditor General, the housing gap will keep growing." I'm thinking of something here today, and I'm going to mention it because I think it's important. With everything that's just been said, we talk a lot about housing and home ownership and how the future of Canada, young people in general, will have a very difficult time owning their first home. But sometimes we forget that because of the Indian Act, and although we're not here to debate it, and there could be positives and negatives seen both ways on that act, but I want to say this: First Nations and Indigenous peoples are essentially robbed of a sense of pride and accomplishment that actually comes with home ownership because of some of the sections of that act. And although it may not apply to every single person today that's Indigenous, it's still a fair amount of them, as I could understand from earlier deliberation. I would like to ask here, like, in your opinion, like, I can imagine how we got here. We're always talking about building capacity. I remember a situation in a Mi'kmaq community in New Brunswick where the chief asked me to visit, and I went down and I visited the community. And I found this house, and it was full of mold. And there were like 16 people or 17 people living in the house. They should have never been that many people living there, number one. The house had poor ventilation. It was black mold. Now, I'm an asthmatic, so as soon as I walked into it, I knew, because I could almost hardly breathe as soon as I walked in. And the chief of the community and the band at the time couldn't afford to fix that mold problem. And as I understood it, there were far more problems than just the unit that I witnessed up close and personal, if you will. And the family that was living in the unit also didn't have the ability or the resources to fix the problem. And as someone said earlier, there was a wooden basement under this house. It was a house that was probably only 30 years old, but it was falling apart. Literally.
Mr. Stewart, you have about 30 seconds left.
Okay, I'm just wondering, with the mold problem, are you seeing any improvement whatsoever? Because by the look of the report, it doesn't look like there's been any improvement. Thank you. Anybody can answer that.
Thank you. If I may begin, the Auditor General's report did indicate mold as one of the key problems as she saw it. But we know that in our communities throughout this country, and particularly in the north, and particularly in remote communities, mold is still an ongoing problem that people are living within every day, and it's impacting their lives and their breathing. As you mentioned, you're asthmatic, and you felt it right away when you went into this house. So that's a basic that needs to be taken care of and addressed. And I don't think it has been to the extent that we need it. What will it take to fix this? Well, it'll take community leadership speaking up, number one. It'll take a collaborative plan between the community and others, government, provincial, federal, whatever, to try to help get this situation rectified. But it is a problem, as you mentioned, and it's not going away. And it hasn't improved. Maybe it's gotten worsened. It's worsened over the last, say, decade instead of improving overall. But again, it's all part of the overall housing problem that we have in Indigenous communities in this country. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this entire area.
Thank you very much. Up next, Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor for about 4 minutes, please.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Chair. And I, too, want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Very sobering to hear. Really, it's sort of the state of the nation, across the nation for First Nations. And being from Quebec, I would like to ask Chief Heyman for more information about the organization Yanoshia. I find that this is I'm sorry to say, the first that I'm really hearing about it. So I'd like to learn more about how that organization is changing basically the ecosystem, the housing ecosystem for First Nations clients.
Okay, so I can speak. I have a couple of key points. So Yanachia is the brainchild of the community of Wendake, who many years ago saw that social housing funding was not meeting their needs and started to look for and create a new solution. So, and because of the restrictions of the Indian Act, they had to use internal resources, and they chose to use the Indigenous Financial Institution, the NACA network, as the mechanism to deliver the housing in Quebec. So Yanachia Housing Finance builds on a network of experienced IFIs. Housing outside of reserve presents one of Canada's most important economic drivers, and Yanachia proposes to make this a reality on reserve as well. Increased construction and renovation activity for private home ownership will yield important economic benefits for First Nations. As I mentioned previously, because of restrictions of the Indian Act, Yanachia is different from other lending programs as it builds on the individual financial and credit strength to provide housing finance without requesting that the First Nation or the government, either through ISK, through its Ministerial Loan Guarantee Program, has to guarantee these loans. So while it's not a panacea, as I had mentioned earlier, there's approximately, with the current level of funding, probably in the range of 60% of our housing needs are not currently being met by any government funding. And so we believe that through the work with Yanachia and private home ownership, upwards of 20% of our housing needs can be addressed. And simply the success that we've achieved in Quebec, as I mentioned, we've done this all with no government funding. You know, we've raised through the sale of bonds and people's individual savings, plus some assistance from private foundations like McConnell, who've invested money, $28 million in total, First Nations, so that we could have this program available on reserve for our members.
Thank you very much for that. Do you think if First Nations had access to other financing options, including the private sector? I mean, is Yanochia sort of, the beginning of something really innovative and that could grow?
Absolutely. And that's what we've been doing for almost the last years. We've been actively advocating and lobbying, the federal government for the necessary capital to make this a national initiative. The interest is there. The IFI network is ready, willing, and able to do it. And we simply need a capital investment to be able to launch this program nationally.
Excellent. I think that's where the federal government needs to be there with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shanahan. Encore une fois, M. Lemire, pour 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
2 minutes, Mr. Lemire. Chair, we often hear talk about truth and reconciliation, but when I read the Auditor General's report, I can see that Indigenous Services Canada, particularly with respect to housing, Indigenous housing, that there is a gap to $44 billion. That is only a very small number of new housing starts, 160 of them, for example. And yet there are some 80,000 that are waiting in line to have their homes renovated, not to mention new housing starts. So is this conciliation? To achieve conciliation, there has to be a partnership. What do you make, Chief Edmund, of the present situation with the federal government?
Well, the present situation is not exactly working for First Nations. CMHC and Indigenous Services determine the level of funding and distribution model that goes to regions and communities. And because they have the vast majority of control over housing programs, at the end of the day, we are asked to do whatever we can with the funding that we receive. And as every witness, as well as myself, is telling you, the funding has been chronically low and underfunded for years. So it will take a massive investment. But the days of Indigenous Services and CMHC telling First Nations how and when and under what circumstances we can meet our needs, I think those days are gone. I think what we're really and truly asking for, and especially through the work that's been done by the Assembly of First Nations, is to sit down with us so we can find solutions. Definitely government funding is a part of it, but there also has to be some give and take from conventional financial institutions. I think the private sector has a role to play as well. And, you can't find solutions unless you're sitting down and having the conversation. The days of folks at CMHC sitting in their offices at 700 Montreal Road and deciding what's in our best interests are gone. They need to sit down and have those conversations with us.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Desjardins, for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll return to Grand Chief Cody Thomas. In relation to your recent discussions, or your most recent discussion with the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Ms. Patty Haju, what have your discussions been and what are your priorities?
Thank you for that. The discussion's been around clean and safe drinking water, but I think even with that last question that was being discussed about CMHC, the point system that they have in place is pretty unfair. And when we asked if there was a mechanism to appeal that process, they said they didn't have anything in place. And I'm just speaking to the Rapid Housing Initiative. I agree with the other chiefs that the system that's in place that doesn't know us as Indigenous peoples and how to meet our needs we're not children. And that I think the approach that's being taken from decades of hardship, I think we're revisit that. I think there's some good things that we can work off of, but being at the table to find those solutions is definitely something that we can kind of go in that right path. And with Patty, it's more around the drinking water aspect. Nothing's really been introduced. The chiefs are very hesitant on some of those dialogues, but unfortunately, we got to find a solution at the end of the day.
No, I appreciate that. And in regards to, I know my team is working with your team actually on that. About tomorrow, it will be tabled for second reading, I believe, and so I'll be speaking to it. I know your team's reached out, and we'll follow up on that tomorrow. Now, back to some of the housing items. Have you submitted an application for housing funding, not just for Enoch, but for other Treaty 6 organizations? And what is a better relationship that we can advocate for here in Ottawa to make certain that the paternalistic relationship that exists between First Nations and the government ends?
I think just coming up with a better formula when it comes to building within the municipality for all of us in Treaty 6 to, and it's not just about apartment buildings. Our children don't want to grow up in apartment buildings. There's some unique initiatives that we've been working on with our province and the city of Edmonton, but we're finding financial shortfalls to look at building a multi-purpose housing project for the Indigenous peoples of our traditional territories here within Treaty 6.
And thank you, Mr. Desjardins. I'm going to try to give you another chance. Turning out to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Chair, thank you to our witnesses for joining us today for this conversation. I want to turn to a part, and this has been touched on a few times, but in the Auditor General's report, which I found concerning, and the quote is, small communities with the poorest housing conditions were approved for less targeted funding from 2018 to 2019 to 2022 to 23 than small communities with better housing conditions, which is obviously obviously counterintuitive to what you would expect to see. You would expect to see communities with the highest need targeted for the for funding. So obviously that's concerning, and I think most people would agree with that. But I found what was equally concerning was the fact that the CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada only partially accepted that concern. And the Auditor General at the time said, we are concerned that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation only partially agree with our recommendation that they work with communities with the poorest housing conditions to ensure that they receive the support they need to improve their housing conditions. The Deputy Minister at the time said we only partially accepted the AG's recommendation there because we didn't agree with the methodology the AG used to come to the conclusion. We can quibble about methodology all we want, but the reality is that this is what's happening on the ground. So I want to put the question to well, frankly, all of our witnesses, but I'll start with Chief Mitchell and Chief Heyman in the room. First, can you confirm that what you're seeing on the ground is that, in fact, the funding that we're talking about, those communities, those Indigenous communities most in need, isn't getting there? And frankly, what should we be doing? Should we not be insisting on CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada to remedy that rather than quibbling about methodology of the Auditor General? So I'll put that to all four of the witnesses.
First of all, thank you for your question and your comment. On the ground, I'm not sure that I can confirm what the Auditor General is stating here. I really don't know if that's the case. In many situations, whether it's in communities or a government relationship with somebody else, sometimes politics comes into play. But I can't confirm that what is being suggested by the Auditor General is in fact true. So what I'd like to do right now is turn to Chief Heyman, who may have some specific awareness or experience with this situation.
So thank you for the question. I tend to agree. I mean, the bigger challenge, quite frankly, is that most of these initiatives are proposal driven, except for regular recurring funding through the legacy programs, which are not required. But rapid housing or any of these new initiatives, it's a proposal driven. And so they're all First Nations across the country are eligible. So you've touched on, one of the most important challenges. Those with the greatest needs have the least capacity. those who have the less needs have the greatest capacity and the ability to submit wholesome and fulsome proposals within the time frames and meeting all of the conditions and criteria to be assessed. So at the end of the day, it appears that, lesser capacity First Nations are getting less of the national budgets, because that really is part of the reality. If you're a small community and you don't have good capacity and good people and the ability to retain, hire, and keep these people, it's your more urban, sophisticated communities who have access to consultants, lawyers, and a host of other support services that are able to get, proposals in. So that really is part of the challenge for all First Nations across the board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neer. I'm afraid that is the time. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for Chief Hammond. How does one approach risk mitigation differently when it comes to First Nations housing projects?
That's a very good question. I think you do it in a way that, recognizing there is no perfect solution or situation. But currently we don't have access to conventional financing through banks unless we, are in a position to guarantee those loans. So we need new opportunities and initiatives that, take away some of the concerns and some of the risk. And quite frankly, I struggle with this question because I know many individuals who, all things being equal, if applied for a mortgage on reserve, off reserve, would be accepted based on their credit strength and their credit history and ability to repay. That same individual applying for a mortgage on reserve may not be eligible for that same mortgage because of risk. And the risk that the bank or financial institution can't come in and seize the property. Through initiatives like Yanachia, we're finding ways through tripartite arrangements where the land and the unit is still held as collateral, but the relationship is really between the financial institution and the individual who has the credit worthiness to be able to secure that mortgage in the first place. So I think really it's a question of, being open to taking on some risk that financial institutions won't. So that's why I'm saying the NACA network and Indigenous financial institutions play a pivotal role. They will go in and they will conduct business and they will, take the risk that conventional banks won't. Because at the end of the day, we believe in our people. And any profits that are generated through the initiatives like Yanachia are going to be reinvested right back into new loans and new mortgages so that more members of our community can benefit. But yes, risk is a big issue, and I'm hoping that through the work we're doing in education of financial institutions and government, that the risk of lending for mortgages on reserve is no greater than lending for mortgages to non-Indigenous Canadians off reserve. We deserve and should have the same tools and access as non-Indigenous Canadians have off reserve for housing.
Is it primarily from First Nations-led businesses that are willing to undertake the risk?
It's not First Nation-led businesses, it's First Nation-led institutions. So the IFIs, if you are not familiar, under the NACA network are more well known for the delivery of financial assistance that supports economic development.
Are you seeing any interest from non-Indigenous institutions, organizations?
We haven't really approached non-Indigenous institutions and organizations. We've stayed primarily focused in on addressing our issues to the government of Canada while utilizing and looking at, the development of our own capacities and institutions nationally.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking for directions here from the committee where the clock, of course, ticks on regardless of how we proceed. What I'm going to propose is that we do 4 slots, 2.5 minutes each, looking really for the consent from the government and the official opposition. This doesn't really impact the other 2 parties as much. Would you be all right with that? We'll do 4 slots, then take a recess, and then go to the next witness. So, and Mr. Nader, is that okay with your side as well? Okay, all right. Very good. I will give you a 30-second or 10 seconds. Who will be your speaker? All right, Mr. Malil, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to, similar to my first questions, I think I'll start in the room, and if folks online have anything to say, please jump in. I want to ask, in the report it mentioned that the government has not had assurances that all housing units built on First Nations or repaired with federal funding actually met applicable building standards. And that's something that I think we would all agree would not be acceptable anywhere else in the country, and it shouldn't be acceptable on First Nations. But however, that's what was found by the Auditor General, and I'm wondering, of genuine curiosity, if that's perhaps a function of challenges getting an inspector or somebody up to a First Nation to be able to do that work, or if it's simply neglect on the part of the government. So maybe Chief Heyman, if I could start with you, if you have any comments on that.
So inspection services and making sure units are built in the National Building Code are key principles for us as First Nations. And I guess it depends on which region you come from and what capacities you have. I come from the Quebec region where, fortunately, we have strong tribal councils. So communities who, like mine, who are small communities who would not necessarily have the financial resources to hire all of the expertise that we need in housing, are able to pool our resources and have them delivered under a tribal council. So we have engineers, architects, building inspectors that work with and support our communities to ensure that our units are being built to the National Building Code. And it's key, because at the end of the day, if we're not, the housing needs are so great in our communities, we need to be building quality units that are going to last 25 years. Because if they don't, then that family, 10, 15 years down the line when that house is condemned, are suddenly added back into the needs list, and the needs just continue to get larger. So I think it really depends on which province, which region, which jurisdiction. But one of the key elements that we need to ensure being able to build the National Building Code is ensuring that we have the financial resources available so that we can build those units and, more importantly, have the technical support services available as well.
Thank you very much. That is your time, I'm afraid. Next up, Ms. Bradford for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to direct my questions, please, to Chief Peters. So last October, the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq signed a historic co-developed framework agreement with the Government of Canada with a goal to work together on the transfer, control, delivery, and management of First Nations housing and infrastructure services to participating Mackinac First Nations. Can you explain what co-developed means and what the process was like working with the Government of Canada on this framework?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things is when we talk about co-development, of course, is everybody working together. I was part of that discussion right from the get-go, and one of the first things I talked about is there a true commitment here on both parties, the Tribal Council as well with ISK, and also CMHC was part of some of the discussions. Things seem to be going well, but it seems to be taking longer because we always seem to be changing parties at the other end of the other side of the table as things move forward. So it's moving forward, but it's slow. I'm always very concerned about timelines and not meeting schedules. So basically, we are still behind it. I want to make sure that, there's still a commitment there, that things continue to move forward. And as you know, the Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq just represents 8 communities here in Nova Scotia. But you also have to ensure that leadership is well aware of how this all works, and who's all involved with it. So it is working, but it's very, very slow. Is the trust there? Well, when things go slow, leadership tries to figure out what is happening, how come things aren't moving faster. But there is a commitment. I'll always continue to try to push that we have a commitment as we move forward. So it is moving, but not as fast as we like. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And how specific are the funding categories under this framework, and how did you determine the categories?
Well, one of the things that I ensured that the technical people really truly understand how the system actually all works, and ensure that we have a complete breakdown of how the existing system works now, how we want to change that system. And through that, we're talking to each of the communities to truly understand that. Because what happens is federal government seems to be here's an agreement, and this is what we want to do, but does it really tell you the details on how it all works and how does it operate? And with that there is a physical responsibility of the government to ensure that the dollars and cents are there, because we're finding it difficult that communities aren't receiving enough to make it work. It's important that we, as far as the risk level at the Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq, ensure that we have enough funding to actually take it over and operate it. We sure don't want to be. We already know what has happened in the past, and I don't want to see CMM fall in that as the federal government has.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair.
Madame Gagné, Sinclair Gagné, 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all the witnesses who are participating today, because housing is not a privilege. It is a right. It is a right that we as parliamentarians must ensure. We want to see the situation for our Indigenous peoples rectified as quickly as possible. There is a program in SHIAC, which is a very good program that I can refer to. We're talking about housing today. There are billions of dollars that have been spent, have been invested, but there has been no improvement made. The situation is still a lamentable one. Mr. Amon, to you. It's a question of approach. One of the reasons why we have this model that I've mentioned is because the Indigenous people are given the autonomy, the self-determination to build their own houses. They don't have to go through outside financial institutions that understand nothing about Indigenous reality. This is an example that should be used by the federal government, which continues to use a method which I think is neo-colonial. The federal government says, here, we're going to make these houses for you, as if the Indigenous people themselves weren't capable of making that decision and building them. Do you believe, and how far do you think Indigenous peoples can organize themselves in terms of funding, but also in terms of human resource?
I think we have the full capacity to manage all of our affairs from start to finish if we're given that opportunity. I think we spent, a lot of time over the past number of years building our capacities up at different levels. As I mentioned, we work inside of our communities to have our members understand the importance of credit rating and having access to credit as viable options going forward. We also teach them about what it is and the responsibilities that come with being a homeowner. We work with, institutions. We work with our tribal councils in different ways to build up the capacities that we need within our communities. So we can have the conversations around takeover, care, and control. And in Quebec, we've been working and have been working at a strategy which really speaks to that. And the first is building capacities at all levels. The second is looking at different funding options with innovation, which exactly fits in with Yanachia and the work that we're doing there. And finally, we know that the government wants to get out of the business of delivering programs to services to our communities. They call it devolution. It's a dirty word in our world. What we would like to really talk about is takeover, care, and control, and not just a program dump. So I think we have the capacities to do it ourselves.
Thank you. I apologize about that. I suspect the next member will follow up on that. Mr. Desjardins, you're going to close us out here. You have the floor for about 2.5 minutes, please.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank all the witnesses, and I do hope that you can also supply written submissions related to our report and the tabling of it in advance of that. I do want to give Grand Chief Cody Thomas an opportunity to speak directly to what you're hearing about from the chiefs that you represent in Treaty 6, and what message you have for the government in terms of priorities related to housing, but also any other priorities that would be important for the government to hear.
I think you're on mute. Grand Chief, I think you're on mute. Yes, from the top, please. You are still muted. Oh.
How's that?
That's good. As I say, when you want something done, do it yourself, and very good. Over to you, Grand Chief.
Exactly. I don't pay these guys big bucks for nothing. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think I'd like to stress the fact that when it comes to the equity side of things on reserve, we have a lot of banks that aren't allowing us to be funded through the conventional mortgage aspect. We have created a Section 10 home building opportunity for our members, but at the end of the day, we can't get equity out of these homes as well. I think one thing that would really help is a reporting mechanism to the credit bureau for our members that live on nation, so that they could build that capacity to possibly be able to afford a home off of nation. I think, and this is where the onus falls on us too, the housing home building code. It is within within Treaty 6, where a lot of these home builders come in. They don't even provide home warranty. And that's something that we need to get better at, and having a better standard. So that's one key item. But I think looking at a mechanism of some kind of funding stream to work with all banks within Canada for us to give the opportunity to our current generations and the generations to come to have an opportunity to have a home, because it is a treaty right and it's a human right. And I really appreciate that, Minister, for speaking from the heart, because that was the intent of our treaty. And if we don't put a dent in this now, when is it ever going to happen? So we will write a submission. We are going to possibly set some kind of template for Treaty 6, and maybe possibly for Turtle Island. I commend the chiefs for putting in the work as well. And at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is put in the work. So.
Thank you very much,
30,
Grand Chief.
If you could just keep it brief, I'll allow one more brief question, Mr. Desjardins.
Oh, sure. I have no other further questions, but I do just want to thank all the witnesses for this important work. It was a difficult process to get this meeting called, and I want to just thank all my colleagues, including our chair, for allowing me the opportunity to have this important study investigated. And a special thanks to Grand Chief of the treaty to which I occupy in Alberta, and it means a lot to me that you were available for this. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I want to thank Grand Chief Thomas, Chief Heyman, Chief Mitchell, and Chief Peters for testimony and participation today in relation to the study report to housing in First Nations communities. If you do have additional comments you'd like to make to the committee, please do so through the clerk, and we'll of course consider it, as we will your testimony today. I'm going to now suspend this meeting for about 5 minutes, please. Give everyone a chance to just stretch your leg, and then we'll come back with our next witness. This meeting is suspended for 5 minutes. Conformément à l'article 108.3G,
Pursuant to Standing Order 10831, we are resuming our study of housing of First Nations housing, as was referred to us by the Auditor General on Tuesday, the 19th.
Mr. Michael Wernick, who is the Jaroslawski Chair in Public Sector Management, University of Ottawa. Mr. Wernick has indicated he has no opening remarks, so we're going to proceed to questions here. I will note that, of course, Mr. Wernick is a former Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, and as well served as Clerk of the Privy Council. So, Mr. Wernick, we thought you would be an ideal witness to come in and just talk about this issue. You'll, I'm sure, be well aware from the Auditor's General report that this is Auditor's General's reports that this is an issue that has dogged several governments over many, many years, and looking for your insight on why that might be, and suggestions or clues on reforms that might provide some solutions and insight. So I'm going to turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I just say, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation. And the only reason I didn't prepare a statement was I wanted to maximize the time for dialogue with the committee. This is my 6th appearance at the House of Commons Committee since I retired from the public service. I'm always happy to help a parliamentary committee with its important work.
And we appreciate that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to now turn things over to Mr. Nader. You'll have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chair, through you, thank you to Mr. Wernick for joining us virtually here this afternoon on the Auditor General's report. Obviously, from your experience, we're looking at about a decade and a half, give or take, between the Privy Council office and Deputy Minister at what was then Aboriginal and Northern Development Canada. But I want to focus first around about your time as clerk of the Privy Council, and a phrase that became popular in government, deliverology. And at the time, I think there were many of us who saw deliverology as a bit of a tagline that really didn't amount to much. And with the benefit of hindsight, always there. There was an article in the Globe and Mail from March of 2020 that said, "To anyone who has worked in government, the whole concept of deliverology smacked of warmed-over administration theory repackaged by former bureaucrats turned consultants seeking to monetize their insider knowledge of the public service," which I suspect may describe Mr. Matthew Mendelson, who took the lead on this within government. Obviously, Mr. Mendelson was the guy who drafted the Liberal Party platform in 2015, and then was brought into Privy Council office, which I personally think is a concern from a partisanship perspective, bringing in an individual with clear ties to the governing party. But I will leave that there and focus specifically on the concept of deliverology for this time period. At one point, there was a mandate letter tracking, and of the commitments specifically to Indigenous peoples related to that. When the tracker was abandoned, about half were incomplete. But you were a strong supporter of this idea of deliverology. One quotation I saw was in this article from CBC, quote, "You should try to find ways to measure whether or not you're succeeding. It's a very good discipline, I think. It will lead to better government." And in a speech you gave in October 2018, you said, "There's a lot at stake in getting this right. Trust is going to be stress tested in an election year where there's plenty of space for us to be communicating with Canadians about policy, legislation, and programs and services. The basic tenets of deliverology are at the core." And I know this is a long preamble, but I'm getting to it. But I want to turn specifically to deliverology as it relates to Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. In a 2017 internal audit report from Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, they wrote, "Senior management has taken steps to support a transition to the policy on results and deliverology, recognizing the transition represents a unique opportunity for INAC to improve performance measurement effectiveness and to support a performance measurement culture in the department." So all of this lengthy preamble to say, would you agree that deliverology has failed in this case to actually succeed in seeing results, specifically on First Nations housing? All this focus on deliverology, all this focus on finding results seems to have all been lip service, seems to have all been talk, when in reality nothing was achieved. And when we're focused, in a comment like this from Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, making this transition, but then seeing results after results after results in 20 years. I mean, we're talking 20 years and no results on First Nations housing. Wouldn't you say this was, in a sense, a lost 3 or 4 years where we focused on deliverology but didn't actually achieve anything? So I'll turn you to that for a comment and with a lengthy preamble.
I think I would stand by my comments, and certainly in terms of accountability to Parliament, that it's very important to try to define the objectives you're trying to achieve and then try to figure out how to measure them, and then organize your data collection and your reporting and accountability mechanisms around that. And if that methodology wasn't the right one, then you should still be seeking that kind of learning software in the way that the state operates. So what I would say the lesson of the last 20 years is that pouring money into issues without structural reform will not really change fundamental trajectories. I joined Indian Affairs in 2006, and after 9 years of the Harper government and 9 years of the Trudeau government, my biggest disappointment is that the Indian Act is still there. I would hope that you would all make a commitment that the next Parliament, the 45th Parliament, is the Parliament that repeals the Indian Act. I mean, that is one of the fundamental issues that's obstructing progress on First Nations communities. I'd be happy to go into the specifics of the obstacles to First Nations housing on reserve if you'd prefer. But I think my message to you is you cannot get the results that you're looking for with the legislation and the structures of government we have in place now. Now is the time for deep, profound structural reform.
Back to the concept of structural reform in a future round, but in the 30 seconds I have left, I want to know if you have a recollection of the mold strategy, which was originally brought forward in 2008, and then at some point after that it stopped being used. And when we questioned the department, they seem to have no recollection of when or why or through what means that stopped. Do you have a recollection of why the 2008 mold strategy came into disuse at some point post 2008, and we're thinking around 2013, post 2013? Do you have any recollection on that?
No, I'm afraid I have no line of sight to why that would have happened. I think it leads to the issue of enforceable building codes, which perhaps we can come back to.
Thank you. That is your time, Mr. Nader. Following Mr. Nader, we have Ms. Khalid for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Wernick. We meet again after many, many years, and in similarly hot circumstances, I would say. I'm quite intrigued by your track record of working with different governments, etc. And I really want to talk about housing and how climate change impacts Indigenous communities, specifically with respect to housing. So perhaps you can help guide us, given your vast experience on this. What were the biggest challenges in addressing the First Nation housing gap when you were Deputy Minister responsible? And do you think that those issues are still alive and well today? And what can we do to eradicate them?
No, thank you for the question. I think the fundamentals underlying this issue are the same ones my predecessors had, and they're the same ones that my successors have. The fundamentals are broken. And until Parliament gets around to changing legislation and structures, the department is pedaling into the wind, trying to get results with a very poor toolkit. If you go through a few of them, I mean, for the on-reserve population, which is about half of Canadian Indigenous peoples, the setup is communal land tenure and social housing. It's what some people have called socialist economics and socialist outcomes, but I won't get political there. Everything, because of the Indian Act, is a workaround. It's a workaround land registry. It's a workaround for mortgages, which you heard about, because you can't put up the same kind of security for mortgages. It's a workaround for secure tenure called, certificates of possession. There's almost no private insurance market. There's almost no private sector that builds and manages properties. There's very little multiple unit housing. It's almost all single family dwellings. And there's almost no tapping into the capital markets. And, my truth to power message to you and to the Auditor General is there will never be enough taxpayer money to get where you want to go. You have to tap into capital markets like the rest of Canadians.
Mr. Wernick, do you think that we have made progress over these past 8 years on this file?
Well, I read the Auditor General's report. I think she's kind of a little bit mixing up stock and flow, because the graphs that she chose to present are eye-catching, but they're percentages. And my understanding, and you can certainly correct me, is they're percentages of a growing stock. So this is what I mean by pedaling into the wind. You are chasing a rising population, and you are chasing rising costs. So the unit cost of each dwelling is going up. It's a market that faces exactly the same issues that you do in your constituency. There's a shortage of skilled trade workers. The cost of inputs is going up. And so, you get fewer units of housing for the dollars that are allocated by the finance minister, which is why you're going to have to lever taxpayers' money to get access to capital markets.
Thank you for saying that. Do you think that climate change has impacted the cost of housing, and if so, how so?
Well, it's affected everybody's cost of housing, certainly, in terms of energy inputs and cost of, building materials and that sort of thing. I think it would be just as it is with other Canadians. It'll depend a little bit where you live. There's kind of an assumption that all First Nations communities are remote in the north, but the largest communities are places like Six Nations and Akwesasne and Ganawaki near Montreal and so on. There are issues around floods and fires facing First Nations communities, just as there are in other communities and so on. One of the big legislative gaps, which you could do something about, is there's no enforceable fire codes on reserve. That could be fixed.
That's a really good point. And so I would ask you then, are there any innovative First Nations-led projects that you think the government should be looking at to make sure that we are addressing all of these challenges?
Well, I think that's more for the policy committee, for the the Aboriginal Affairs committees of the House and the Senate. I left 10 years ago, so I'm not completely up to speed, but I know that many communities have very entrepreneurial chiefs and councils, and I think you heard from some of them earlier today, if I understand it, who are doing their best with workarounds. They are trying to find ways to have proxies for mortgages and proxies for rental schemes and proxies for user charges and so on. But they're all workarounds because the fundamentals are unsound. The three biggest workarounds that Parliament gave First Nations are the First Nations Market Housing Fund. I think you should take a look at that. The First Nations Financial Authority, which is a small outfit that does start getting into bond and debenture issues, and the First Nations Land Management Act, which is a way to get out of the Indian Act and take control over zoning and local land use. But none of those is used by a majority of First Nations. They're opt-in. They're not mandatory. They're a path out of the Indian Act. But almost 30 years later, the take-up is disappointing.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Wernick, for all of your service over the majority of your life, and also for being here today. I really appreciate what you've had to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Wernick, you were Deputy Minister for Indigenous Affairs from 2006 till July 2014, and there was a report of the Auditor General in the past that indicated that there was no improvement or very little improvement to the Indigenous situation when you were DM. You were Clerk of the Privy Council until 2019 as well following that, and the report from the AG today indicates that there was in actual fact, a deterioration in the housing situation, a major one, despite the large amounts of monies that were invested. Don't you think that there were conclusions about the steps to be taken today that perhaps are linked back to what was done in the past? The vision that the federal government has of its Indigenous peoples. Well, at the time when I was a deputy minister of that department, it was organized differently. Now there are two departments. Jim Flaherty was the Minister of Finance, and I had budgets that were about a third of the current expenditures. So one of the lessons of the past decade is that this government has almost tripled the amount of services offered to Indigenous communities, but it's very slow in implementation. So the money has tripled, but if I understand correctly, you were one of the people who was mentioned as not believing that the Indian Act should be reformed, should be changed. You didn't really believe that that Indian Act should be set aside. No. At the time, conditions were not in place to do so. There was a very important meeting between the First Nations in around January 2012. But at the time, the conditions weren't there. And to obtain the support of the Indigenous politicians at that time to do that. But now it's 2024. No, absolutely. I am now in favor. It's time. The time has come. The next parliament, after the coming elections, should pass legislation which says simply, but in 10 years' time, the Indian Act will be withdrawn.
No reason that the next parliament, after the next election, could not pass a bill. You're the only people that get to legislate that says 10 years from coming into force, the Indian Act is repealed, and that would force everybody into a decade of hard work on the exit strategy.
Intéressant.
Very interesting. One of the things that we have heard that also is interesting from Chief Eamon in particular was that the Indigenous people do have capacities. They have the capacity to projects and the projects of their own, where they can self-fund, where they can build their own housing units, and that can serve as a model for the rest of Canada. In Quebec, there's difficulty. There was difficulty in getting funding, so that's why Desjardins, for example, was created. But the Yanichia is an example of their doing it themselves. Do you think that in the future that the federal government, having put huge amounts of money out to achieve something, has achieved nothing, and then therefore should be able to move elsewhere? But where would the money come from then, if it wasn't from the government? It would come from themselves, from the Indigenous peoples themselves. For example, in Quebec, Desjardins, Quebec, provides money to individuals, private citizens, for financing building. It's the same type of thing for Yanichia, but also institutions like the FTQ and others have participated in similar programs because they have a vision which is different. The major banks' vision doesn't apply. Yes, I quite agree. If you can get rid of the barriers between communities and the government and private capital and the financial markets, it would be a very good result. But there are barriers, there are obstacles. The problem of getting guarantees, mortgage guarantees, and so on. These are workarounds. Thank you very much.
Desjardins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Warnick, for being present with us today. You have a long career, a career that's been, I'm sure, subject to polarization from all parties, especially as a former member of the Privy Council. You have a reputation in Indigenous country of being one that has sustained largely the issues that are persistent across many of the issues that placate Indigenous communities today. We heard from the Auditor General, for example, in her opening remarks of this report that was the 4th time since 2003 that we have raised concerns about housing in First Nations communities, and 20 years later, many of these concerns persist. Despite these audits, we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation have made little progress in supporting First Nations to improving housing conditions in their communities. What responsibility do you bear for any of that?
So Sheila Fraser wrote a wonderful piece on Indigenous policy and services to First Nations in the preface, 6-page preface to her spring 2011 report. I commend that to the committee and to anybody who's watching. She identified 4 structural barriers to making any progress on services to First Nations. 1, lack of a legislative base. 2, lack of clarity about service levels. 3, lack of appropriate funding mechanisms. And 4, lack of organizations to support local service delivery. That's as true now as it was in 2011. I commend to you also the report of this committee from February 2012 in response to that.
How did you respond to that? The first, just that first part.
Structural reform.
How did you respond in the huge amount of time you've been responsible for this work? How did you respond to those claims?
I think that people that are in those positions work with their ministers to do the best they can with the tools that Parliament has given them. And if you want to go through all of the things that my 4 ministers and I were able to accomplish between 2006 and 2014, I'd be happy to do that if the chair will give me the time.
You obviously, you obviously claim victory for some of those things. You're talking about a great list. I'm talking about the other list, the list that First Nations communities have submitted in relation to the immense failures. And so, I don't think we're going to get a response from you today that will satisfy the dissatisfaction Indigenous people experience with INAC and its former entities, and including the entities today. But nonetheless, it's important for me to be able to highlight this paternalistic attitude, the attitude that continuously placates Indigenous communities. Today, one of the gentlemen who were just present here today, who said he's been involved in this work 36 years and he hasn't seen any substantial movement or direction in the attitude of civil servants, and particularly the deputy ministers, and you occupy over 1/3 of that time, to any substantial change in your own perspective. To be very frank, Mr. Warden, you're not an expert at the lived experiences of Indigenous people. You're an expert at advising the government on the legislative frameworks that are asked of deputy ministers. And so the Indian Act is one of those, is an example of that. We see many times instances where, termination policy, for example, you would have been subject to these ideas. Harold Cardinal, a famous philosopher, Indigenous person, in my community, the last time a Trudeau tried to tell First Nations in Alberta that we're going to do away with the Indian Act, we responded with the Red Paper. Have you ever read the Red Paper?
I assume that's a rhetorical question, or?
Well, at this point, given your record, I don't know if you've actually read it.
Of course.
So it's a real question. You have read it.
So what is your question?
My question is, have you read the Red Paper, and have you listened to the concerns of Indigenous people when you say things so flippantly like Let's just do away with the Indian Act. Let's give 10 years as a blunt instrument force to set a timeline on the future of Indigenous people. Like, why would you respond that way if you read the red paper?
You are the Parliament of Canada. There are 41 million Canadians. Only 338, soon to be 343 of you.
But I'm not the one
change
recommending we
legislation.
abolish the Indian Act in 10 years and set a clock on it.
You don't have to take my advice. This is truth to power. If you want,
I want to know why you're advising something so ludicrous as to set a time frame like that. What if I set a time frame on you? I said your rights will be exterminated in 10 years, and you deal with it, Mr. Warnick.
There would be an exit strategy to self-government agreements and other kinds of legislation. We've been trying exit strategies for the last 30 years, and you are the one.
Where does the perspective of exit strategy? Why? Why does that perspective exist?
With negotiating agreements with specific self-governments. You know that there are over 630 distinct First Nations. There are over 70 tribal councils. There are about 50 regional and provincial organizations. And
It's clear to me why this is failing. Your attitude today, even, you haven't learned anything in your time at Privy Council. You haven't learned anything as your time as a deputy minister. And the results are clear. Over 20 years, Mr. Warnick, and you claim no responsibility, and today you have the audacity to come to this committee and set a time frame for the abolition of Indigenous rights, claiming there's an exit strategy in the future, even though you've read the red paper. I don't have any questions for you, other than to say, Mr. Warnick, this is my time, other than to say you are likely the greatest Indian agent we've seen in 100 years.
Thank you.
So I did not say that there is an exit strategy. I said that there would be 10 years for dialogue between governments and First Nations to build better exit ramps from the Indian Act structures.
Thank you very much. Beginning our next round, I'm going to turn to Mr. Melillo. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Warnick, in response to previous questions, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting. You said that there would never be enough taxpayer dollars to address the needs that exist. And I thought that was interesting. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to that in your view, how the private sector could be better leveraged and utilized to address the housing gaps specifically.
Well, I think housing and infrastructure go together. You need land. You need to have serviced land in terms of lots. So you're going to need water, wastewater, electricity, internet, and the kinds of things that make land into serviceable lots. And then you have to put housing units on top of it, whether they're single family or multiple home. Land, infrastructure, and housing. So if you're going to do this on an all cash upfront basis, which is what the Indigenous Services Department has to do with whatever you've got from the Minister of Finance, you can only do so much, and you need an algorithm or funding formula, the algorithm for spreading limited resources across a lot of demands. Housing and infrastructure is only one. When I was there was a cap, the famous 2% cap, price and volume escalator, that covered everything. Child and family services, income assistance, education, post-secondary education, housing, and infrastructure were all capped with a 2% program escalator, brought in by Paul Martin and capped by 15 years by finance ministers. It was lifted by the current government, and spending has nearly tripled on these services. But if the results are not getting better fast enough, then you have to think something else is missing. And I would say, and you're not going to like this any better, you're not going to get where you want with the department model, because a department pushing contribution agreements out to First Nations is not the toolkit that is going to generate housing and infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump in there. You mentioned the spending that has, I believe you said it has tripled. And I just want to touch on that because the Parliamentary Budget Officer has had recently, a couple of years ago, released a report titled Research and Comparative Analysis of Crown Indigenous Relations and ISC, CERNAC, and Indigenous Services Canada, where they mention, the PBO mentions that we've seen this dramatic increase in funding under the current government, but notes that it hasn't led to an equal amount, an equal level for the ability of the department to achieve its desired goals. So there's a lot of spending, but not necessarily equivalent outcomes that you would expect from that. In your experience, can you speak to why that would be? why this spending is going into the bureaucracy and not coming out the other end to support First Nations and Indigenous communities that rely on it.
Okay, well, very little of it is actually staying in the department. The overwhelming amount of money that you allocate and appropriate to the departments goes out as transfer payments to First Nations communities, tribal councils, and other entities and service agencies. You will find it in GC Info base under grants and contributions. A contribution agreement is, here is some money, report what you did with it. So the over-reliance on contribution agreements is something that previous Auditor Generals and previous Public Accounts Committees have commented on and criticized. It's the only real way to get data, and it's the only way to actually change outcomes, is to put a lot of conditions into contribution agreements. And that's one of the things that Sheila Fraser means by not having a legislative base. You'll be familiar with other programs like old age pensions and unemployment insurance, student loans, and so on, where the eligibility and the formula is defined in statute, in legislative language. There's almost none of that in the First Nations world. I spent a lot of time working on First Nations education legislation. Sadly, we still don't have any. We do now have First Nations Child and Family Services legislation, but it's needed in other areas. So I do think that you're chasing, as I said, pedaling into the wind of a rising population and rising costs. The costs of salaries for teachers, the cost of what you have to pay local school boards as tuition for First Nations kids who go to school off reserve. All of the costs are rising, the population is rising, so the money is always going to be chasing outcomes.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Up next is Mr. Weiler. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I also want to thank Mr. Wernick for being here today to help provide some input for our study that we're doing on the housing report from the AG. I do want to bring back up the topic that you first brought up in your opening, and a couple of my colleagues brought up on the Indian Act and the need to to move away from it. And I fully agree that this would deliver great benefits for Indigenous communities were we able to do that, and because it's, I would also just say I was a little alarmed from my colleague Mr. Stewart talking about the positives of this act, when we know this is an act by its very nature, which is racist and treats Indigenous peoples as wards of the state and has many impediments to not only dealing with issues like getting housing built, but economic development and so many other issues. But putting a 10-year timeline on this is a huge challenge. As you mentioned, there's 630 Indigenous communities across the country. And while there has been some progress through modern treaties, through self-government agreements, and otherwise, it's a huge challenge to move ahead because each Indigenous community is distinct. And so how would you recommend that the government or future governments move ahead with this in order to be able to accelerate more self-determination and self-governance for nations?
No, it's a really good question, and obviously it has to be done in partnership, walking the path together. There's no way, and I don't want to be misrepresented as saying this should be done unilaterally by any Parliament of Canada, but I think it's 2026 when the next Parliament starts, and after all of this time, we can't keep blaming the Indian Act and working around the Indian Act and not face up to the fact that it is software whose time has come and we need to move on. What I would also suggest you do, because apparently the next government is going to abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank and strand its loan portfolio, I think there's actually an opportunity in there to bring housing and infrastructure together. My advice to any of your election platform commitment committees is a complete reworking of the machinery of the federal government in this area. Take all of the housing and infrastructure programs and put them together. Take the housing out of Indigenous services, take the housing out of CMHC, add it to the Indigenous portfolio of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and create a crown corporation that will do First Nations housing and infrastructure in a very professional 2026 kind of way. You could give it all of the tools that a private sector firm like Brookfield has. You could put a board of management on it. like a real board of directors to hold the staff and the executives to account. You could ensure that the majority of that board was named by First Nations. You could give that corporation an inspection function. One of the problems is there just aren't enough people out there. And if you bring in enforceable building and fire codes, you need an inspection service. So I think if you brought all of this together and they could partner with capital markets and private sector firms, you would be able to do something. If we just keep putting money into the same tools, don't expect the results to fundamentally change.
Thank you, and I would agree with that. It's truly alarming when you do visit in Indigenous communities and see some of the states of housing. And while we are seeing the effects of some of the additional funding, the tripling of funding, there's a community in my riding that hadn't seen a single dollar in housing investment in 30 years until a year ago. So these are the types of things that absolutely need to change. And but maybe you could just provide some testimony to this committee about what you see as the biggest challenge in addressing the housing gap, and if it's the same today as when you first became the Assistant Deputy Minister in 2006.
Deputy Minister, but well, I mean, housing has been built. I think that the Auditor General has presented data in percentages that make it look like there was no progress. Of course, there were housing units built. And to go to an earlier question, there are lots of communities that are innovative and have built high quality housing and are doing all kinds of interesting things. And community leadership is a huge part of that. So, I mean, I think that raises the issue of what the funding algorithm should be. There will never be, it's one of these programs like many others where there will always be more demand and possible uses than funds that are available. Even if you continue to increase the funding, it'll be finite and you need an algorithm for allocating it. When I was there were basically regional pots of money. So British Columbia had a pot, Alberta had a pot, Ontario had a pot, and so on. And then there were a lot of negotiations with chiefs in that region on allocation formulas for, very finite resources, where the department had to say no a lot. Now, the Auditor General has a very specific view of what equitable means, but it's basically a policy judgment, even a political judgment of what is the fairest way to allocate finite resources. She puts a lot of emphasis on torquing the money to where the most need is. I could also argue maybe you want to seize opportunities where they come up. Build an entire subdivision because land becomes available, or an opportunity to lever a claims settlement or a litigation settlement comes into a community's hands and they suddenly have the opportunity to build an entire subdivision of new housing. So, or maybe there's a community that has tapped into
Mr.
capital
Wernick,
markets and can put up 50% of the money.
I have to move on. The time is elapsed, but I'm sure members will come back to this. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair de Gagné pour 2 minutes 30.
2 minutes, 30 seconds, Madame Sinclair de Gagné. Thank you, Mr. Warnick. In replying to my colleague, Mr. Weiler, just now, what you are describing as a potential solution would be a Crown corporation where, according to you, would be productive, effective, and building new housing. That's the direct opposite of what we just heard from the chiefs, the Grand Chiefs, and in particular, Mr. Eamon, who spoke to the program, the Nichia, which is the direct opposite of these approaches. The goal is to get houses built, and to think that it's the federal government that is constantly interfering in Indigenous affairs. When you have Indigenous peoples who are truly very competent and can take care of their own business. So what would the purpose be of this new Crown Corporation? To build houses. We know that what exists is not efficient. the performance has shown us day after day that what is proposed by the government and what the government operates is quite the opposite of what Indigenous peoples would want. Giving power to a new Crown corporation that will miraculously effect change on the reserves is false. It's the opposite of Yanechia, of what it proposes, because I believe that it would be very interesting indeed well, yes, I do agree that there are barriers, significant ones in the Indian Act. You've spoken to that. But there are solutions that exist, solutions for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. And we in the Bloc Québécois agree that this is a principle that we want for the Indigenous people in Quebec. And so I encourage you to look at programs like Yanechia.
There was a question there. Suivant, c'est Mr. Desjardins. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do want to return just to the perspectives you hold, Mr. Warnick, which I find problematic and outdated in relation to the efforts of Indigenous people to return our country to a position of understanding its deep relationship as a colonial state with that of its assumed title over land and jurisdiction, manifested in treaties. So what is your perspective of the treaties, particularly the historical treaties?
I'm sorry, what is your question?
What is your perspective of the historical treaties in relation to the fact that Canada has largely assumed title via these historical treaties?
Well, I think what you have to look for is ways to get out of the Indian Act, which sits on top of the numbered treaties 1 to 11 across most of central and western Canada. Other parts of Canada, as you know, have modern treaties. All of the north, there are almost 24 modern self-government land claims agreements, and in most of those, you have much clearer Aboriginal title and ownership of the land base.
So, we have an agreement, not necessarily a trust, about the need to actually reduce barriers between the treaty and you're suggesting that Parliament is the assumed sovereignty, has assumed this, not just the entirety of its responsibility under the treaty, but it's now the only vehicle you're suggesting out of this paternal relationship, correct?
No, that's misrepresentation. It is a nation-to-nation relationship. It is a crown.
Warnick, you said that. You said the Indian Act, which is an act of Parliament. Other than the act, other than Parliament, I'm saying, what if we just assume the opposite, Mr. Warnick? What if we assume that an Indigenous government like that of Treaty 8 were to legislate its own laws and bylaws and just ignore the operative power of Parliament? Would that be okay?
Well, no, every self-government agreement is a subject of an act of Parliament. There is a treaty implementation.
That's where we fundamentally disagree. That's an assumption, Mr. Warnick. That's an assumption that Sir John A. Macdonald and the great minds to which it seems like your perspective shares, that the Parliament is supreme in these decisions. When, as a matter of fact, if it's a partnership that's nation to nation, why would Parliament have these kind of ludicrous powers?
Are you suggesting that Parliament would cede all of its lawmaking powers and its power of the purse to approve the allocation?
I'm saying it never had those powers.
I'm afraid
never had those powers.
I'm afraid that is the time. Turning now to Mr. Stewart, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wernick, I heard you talking about an idea that would place most of the housing programs under one roof. I believe you stated that you believed it would be possible if you built one Crown corporation that would in fact solve many of the problems that are faced by Indigenous peoples today. I'd like you to obviously you were Deputy Minister for a long time and that didn't get done. So I'd like you to explain why that didn't get done when you were Deputy Minister and why, if it got done today, it would make a difference. Thank you.
Because Deputy ministers don't get to change the structures of government, only Parliament does. So it would take a piece of legislation to create that Crown Corporation, which is not about government control. As I said, it could be with substantial First Nations governance. You could have a board of directors that was named by First Nations people. I just think it's a better model than the department pushing contributions agreement, which is what we've done for the last 50 years with limited results.
Is it fair to say that you've shared that idea as your role in Deputy Minister with the current government that's been in place for the past 9 years?
I've had no contact with this government since I left it 5 years ago.
5 years ago, but that's not my question. With all due respect, you were a deputy minister, and as a former minister in New Brunswick, I can tell you that deputy ministers have a wish list, sometimes 20 or 30 years long, and they march them into your office as soon as you get there, knowing that you might be just a little bit green and naive and that you might bite the bullet on something they've been trying to get done for decades. So my question is, again, in the first 4 years of your being a deputy minister while this administration was in power, how did they sit with your Crown Corporation idea? Who did you take it to? Who turned it down? Who was against it? Why?
Sorry, I was a deputy minister under the Harper government. All of my 8 years were with Stephen Harper's government. My ministers were Jim Prentice, Chuck Strahl, John Duncan, and Bernard Valcourt. We were busy with other things.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. The reason I asked if it was Trudeau's government is because you said you hadn't spoken to this government in 5 years. So I'm assuming, so you're telling me you never once brought this Crown Corporation idea to the current administration. That was actually my question.
No, in 2017, the government had already reached the political agreement with the Assembly of First Nations that led to the split of the department. The creation of a split department, Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations, was something that the Assembly of First Nations has been promoting for quite a while. There had already been a political decision to make that change in 2017.
So do you believe the Assembly of First Nations idea was a poor idea?
I think that it's 2024 now, and it's worth taking a look 6 or 7 years later after the split in the organization. I'm sure that it's accomplished some positive things. I think bringing health into Indigenous services was a good idea, but it has its limitations because it's still a department pushing contribution agreements model.
All right,
and
thank you. Thank you for that. It's my floor. My floor. Thank you. Thank you for that once again. I left the room for a moment, and as I came back in, I heard one of the MPs criticizing me for saying that the Indian Act brought both positives and negatives. If that Liberal MP represented First Nations at the length I have, he would know something. He would know that despite the imperfections of the Indian Act, and it was done in 1876 by Alexander Mackenzie, Liberal Prime Minister, he would know damn well that First Nations are scared to have that opened up because they're scared of government always taking something from them. And it's not perfect. And don't criticize me if you don't know the file. You're better off shutting your mouth if you don't know anything about it. So here's what I would say to you, Mr. Weiler, and listen closely. You're the government. You want to get rid of the Indian Act? You open up and get rid of it. Let's see you do that. You have the power. You're the governing party. Let's see you finally change the name. Look at the name of it even, Indian Act. It's 2024 and we still have that name and you're over there criticizing. Talk to some First Nations people and you'll realize there's a great fear in what actually happens when that gets opened up in this country. How much time, Chair?
15 seconds.
That's all for me, and I hope he will educate himself accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and interesting where we're going in this meeting, but it's a good exercise to look back at the I guess in the near past of the last 20 years as to what could have been done, what should have been done, but ultimately was not done. Mr. Warnick, given your experience with both governments during that time, can you point to any particular time or decision where that would have changed the trajectory of outcomes for housing for First Nations vis-a-vis how the federal government approached resolving this problem?
Well, if casting my mind back, the one significant thing in the housing area was the First Nations Market Housing Fund. It was created by Minister Flaherty in a budget, I believe 2008. It might be 2009. You could check on that. And it was designed with First Nations advice and input specifically to try to access capital markets and try to create something closer to market housing conditions as an experiment. It's still there. You can Google and look up the First Nations Market Housing Authority, and they have made progress in some communities. And as I said, the First Nations Land Management Act is really important because it gives communities complete control over land use and zoning and how the land in their communities is going to be used. That and take up of that has been really important. And we tried to remove barriers to make that more accessible. There was specific legislation passed by Parliament back then to allow the property development at Squamish Nation in British Columbia using something called FNCDA, another acronym, First Nations Industrial and Commercial Development Act. And that made the housing development in Squamish, which is still a work in progress, at least possible. So there are workarounds and attempts to create paths out of the Indian Act and to create better models have been introduced by every government over the last 40 years.
Thank you for that, because I think that's what a number of members here found very interesting about the testimony that we heard from Chief Heyman in the last panel. And Chief Heyman testified that where were they able to get a good portion of their capital to finance the institution was through bond markets, and I think that there's something there. I think that's something that's worthwhile to explore because, of course, as we all know, housing, land, these are assets, and assets have value that can be financed, and indeed. Looking at a social finance point of view, reinvesting in the communities, are these models that you're familiar with? Are these things that came across the table when you were in office?
No, absolutely. And again, these are workarounds, and there have been attempts in some communities to access this. The First Nations Finance Authority is an attempt to do that. And there are attempts to, use ministerial guarantees. You use the Crown as the backstop for the loan by a First Nation. It is the First Nation that's doing the building, that's doing the contracting, that's hiring the architects, that's hiring the contractors and the firms. And this is a real struggle, truth to power, because these are often small communities, small governments, and small staff. So these are hard things for the city of Montreal or the city of Lethbridge. It's very tough on a First Nations community to deliver this. So I think it will. Most communities will always need some kind of partner to work with, and unless there's going to be a turning off the tap of taxpayers' dollars, somebody has to manage the flow of taxpayers' dollars from Parliament to these communities, which is why I think we should try. If you just keep trying the same model and you're not getting better results, you should at least try a different approach. The difference is, you're having a lively political debate about the cost of mortgages for young families in Canada. Well, underneath that is the assumption that almost everywhere in the world and everywhere else in Canada, housing and infrastructure is largely debt financed. It's not cash up front. The only people that pay cash up front are Aboriginal Affairs, Indigenous Services, and maybe the Saudi Arabians. Everybody else uses some form of debt financing to build assets with a long life, infrastructure and housing, and would fit in that, whether it's power grids, water, wastewater, internet connections, and so on. And we did a lot that we could on a cash basis, but really and we did a very innovative market finance deal in Northern Ontario that you're probably familiar with, the Wate Power thing, which brought electricity to about 20 communities in northwestern Ontario, and it will come online this fall, which I'm very pleased to see. But that's the direction to push in. It's not just pouring more money into broken social housing models. It's to try to find ways to access private capital markets and get 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 leverage for whatever Parliament's able to provide.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. I'm going to now begin our third round. I think I'm going to have truncated rounds of 4 minutes and 2 minutes. So, Mr. Lilly, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wernick, just like to ask you about the census data that the government's using for this. So the Auditor General's report noted that the data is being used from the census of 2001, which certainly doesn't make a lot of sense to, I think, most parliamentarians and Canadians across the country using such outdated data for making decisions like this. Could you explain why that could be the case, and is there any reasonable explanation why they could not use more recent data?
I have no line of sight to that. I'd just be speculating. I would note for the committee that the 2021 census data will be released in July as under the rubric of the Indigenous Peoples Survey, and there'll be a rich array of census data available to all Canadians and parliamentarians this summer.
Okay, thank you very much. And then just a bit more broadly, you spoke of, and you've mentioned some specifics here, but you spoke right off the hop in response to Mr. Nader's original questions about deep structural reforms that are needed. Again, I know you touched on it throughout the entirety of your comments. I'm wondering if there's anything that has been left out from that that you can speak to specifically.
Well, I mean, you know, I'm challenging you to think about how to get out of the Indian Act for sure. I do think that instead of flogging the model of a department pushing contribution agreements, that it's worth considering in all of the election. You have an election next year. Any one of the five or six parties could put this in your platform, a commitment to redo the structures of government and create a First Nations housing corporation, working closely with communities and First Nations leadership and with an enormous amount of First Nation leadership. It would be a step towards that kind of full devolution that the other member was talking about. But so that is one. I would definitely commend pass enforceable building codes, pass enforceable fire codes. That's really important. And there's legal ambiguity in the law right now about who owns the physical assets on reserves that makes it very hard to get insurance. So it would be possible to put some lawyers on this and amend the legislation to clarify that the First Nations are the owners of the assets in their communities.
Thank you very much. I think I've got about a minute and a half left, and I'm going to offer that to my colleague from the NDP.
Mr. Chair, as a matter of a point of order, can I allow this minute and a half to be in addition to my regular time with the consent of the bloc?
You mean run your time together?
Exactly.
Sure. Do you want to go now, or do you want to go in your turn? I'm fine with it either way.
You can go now.
Okay, sure. Now
Right,
then.
so you've got just over 3 minutes, and go ahead.
Sure. So, Mr. Wernick, at least we agree on some things. We agree that there's a fundamental need to change the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I think we both agree there. And I'd hope to have your indulgence in listening to what I'm saying, as I hope that we've heard a lot from you in regards to your ideas about this utopian society that can exist by Canada's own parliamentary processes and the lawmaking authorities that have been assumed in this place. We agree that this fundamental difference must exist. This change is required. But the issue you just pointed out a second ago, this need for even the courts, for example, don't know whose land or who owns what. And this has been the question of jurisdiction more recently. For example, the Daniels in Canada case in 2016 finally answered the question as to who has the jurisdiction to legislate on behalf of Métis persons. This is a live conversation we're having on who has the assumptive title or supreme law-making authority in a colonial country like Canada. And that question is still being debated, but you've largely assumed that that's been operational. Wouldn't you agree that that question in your mind's answered, that Canada has the supreme law-making authorities, just like you mentioned the abolition of the Indian Act should take place by Parliament and it should be replaced by Parliament. There's a Crown Corporation created by Parliament. That Parliament, a place of non-Indigenous people, should largely be responsible for the continued paternalism that is largely placated First Nations. And so I want to give you an opportunity to speak about the question, who has assumed sovereignty in Canada?
I think that one of the reasons we've had over 25 Supreme Court rulings since the creation of Section 25 and 35 is that Parliament has not been able to fill a lot of the issues with legislative solutions. So people have gone to the courts and the courts have filled the space. There's ample opportunity for the Parliament of Canada to clarify all kinds of issues within the framework that's set by the Constitution. My view, and it's just an opinion, is that the Charter applies to all Canadians, the Constitution applies to all Canadians, and Parliament cannot abdicate its sovereignty over lawmaking on behalf of 41 million Canadians. All Canadians
But that's the truth. Just stop there. That's enough. That point right there is the point to which we dispute, I believe, Mr. Warnick. I do not believe that Canada, like as you mentioned, has the supreme lawmaking authority over all Canadians. Because albeit, if you're going to assume that Indigenous people are Canadians, that all of them are Canadians, and some will submit that they are, but not all will submit that that's the truth, particularly in unceded territory. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, then the lawmaking by First Nations communities affects their neighbors and other Canadians. It has to be a nation-to-nation relationship, which is reciprocal, non-ingérence, non-indifference.
Yeah, but they had assumed title, and I think you've answered my question in your deflection of being unable to answer directly the fact that it's your position that all Indigenous people have been enfranchised. That's your position, correct?
My view is that Parliament is the lawmaking authority for all Canadians.
But that truth exists because you believe all Indigenous people are enfranchised. Correct?
I don't know what you mean by I don't know what you mean by enfranchised.
Enfranchised? Oh my God! You know, it's not even worth talking about this any longer, Mr. Warnick. It's the perspective of Indian agents for the last 150 odd years that Indigenous people should be assimilated, enfranchised, or conquered. And you've confirmed in many ways in this discussion today that that's your perspective as well. So it's clear to me why the issues that placate Indigenous society today are with us.
That is a gross misrepresentation.
No, that's the truth, Mr. Warnick.
Gentlemen, I wouldn't say that. Look, we have interpreters here. Please, Mr. Warnick, to stop for a second. Mr. Warnick, I'm going to give you a moment to respond. We have issues with interpretation and the interpreters. Mr. Digely, you had a final word there. I'm going to allow Mr. Warnick to respond briefly, and then we're going to move to the next person. But I gave you more than your time.
So the question, which was, does he assume that all Indigenous people are Canadians for the purposes of sovereignty and jurisdiction of Canada? That's the question.
I believe he did. Mr. Warnick, I'm going to give you not a lot of time, but I will allow you to respond for the record, please.
The constitutional framework, including Section 25 and 35, includes the inherent right to self-government by Indigenous peoples, which has been interpreted in various ways by the courts, and it is given expression by specific agreements, treaties, and legislation.
Thank you. Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, vous avez...
Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, you have about 2 minutes. And then after that, I have 1 or 2 questions for the analysts. And then after that, we'll bring the meeting to an end. Thank you. Mr. Warnick, I like the fact that you cited non-interference, non-indifference, which was France's position towards Quebec. And I was very happy with that. Not at all, not at all. So, well, let me try to convince you.
If Canada is divisible, so is Quebec.
So, well, yes, all right. But it does reflect, that's saying that reflects of the essence of Canada. I would just point out that what was said in that idiom was something that was extremely dangerous, and I find it shameful because that was almost something that spoke to partitions. Now, my question, Canada has $120 million in loans in terms of capital, loans made to Indigenous peoples. Where is the money coming from that is used by Indigenous people from the outside? It comes from private funders, and hundreds of units of housing have been made under programs like the Yanichia. It is a Quebec program, and it is one that works very well indeed, if not better than government programs. These are facts. And do you think that then that Canada should draw its inspiration from the Quebec model, which is a sister nation to a brother nation? Well, it's difficult to say what can happen in other provinces. It's up to the First Nations to decide. Thank you very much.
A question from the chair. Mr. Wernick, I think you've given us a lot to consider here today. This is not a testimony that I think that I certainly, as chair, had expected. In fact, your comments remind me of about 15 years ago. I went to study at the London School of Economics, which was well regarded as a bastion of left-wing thinking, supposedly, or so I was warned. When I arrived on campus, and I discovered that the school was rooted in the belief that private property was fundamental to building. I think you've touched on that today. Here's a question I have for you that I'd like a response. During your time as Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, the government was focused on creating economic opportunities in the resource sector and First Nations self-government accountability. It has been argued that those priorities led to systemic underfunding of basic public services such as housing, health, and education, especially in remote communities where the cost of providing these services can be significantly higher and where there may not be significant administrative capacity or economic activity. How do you respond to this criticism, and if any thoughts on it, please?
Well, I mean, I think there's many things in there. The fundamentals about communal land tenure and social housing I've commented on before, so you're always going to be working around in that sense. There are initiatives out there like Manny Jewell's property ownership initiative. I know that the Niska people have decided to create a form of private tenure within Niska lands. There's all kinds of experimentation. I think a lot of these have to be community-led, to be very clear, not government-imposed. But government can remove the obstacles. And I think you should be looking for all of the obstacles for community empowerment and economic development. There has to be income and economic life in communities for them to be healthy and to have good social and health outcomes. That's true for all Canadians. So, you're not going to like this, but I mean, my view is, looking back on it, that the Harper government was fairly ambitious on structural reform, but very stingy on funding. And the Trudeau government was very generous on funding, but has very little to show for it in structural reform. One of these days, we'll get a government that wants to do deep structural reform and fund it properly.
Thank you very much. We all appreciate your time here today. I will now adjourn this meeting, and the subcommittee will reconstitute itself in just a few minutes. Thank you again, everyone. We do have votes at 7:30, just for those who might not be looking at their emails. This meeting is adjourned.